Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I've been sheriff of Millbrook County for 15 years now, and I can tell you that in all my time wearing this badge, nothing has shaken me quite like what happened at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Before I tell you what we found in that house, you need to understand something about our community. This is the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where front doors stay unlocked, and where the biggest crime we usually deal with is teenagers drinking beer behind the old grain elevator. My name is Sheriff Tom Bradley, and I've lived in Millbrook County my entire life. Born here in 1965, went to school here, married my high school sweetheart here, and figured I'd die here too. It's a quiet corner of rural Illinois where cornfields stretch to the horizon, and the only sounds at night are crickets and the occasional freight train passing through town. Population 8,400 on a good day, spread across 400 square miles of farmland and small communities with names like Cedar Falls, Meadowbrook, and Pine Ridge. My daddy was a deputy sheriff here for 23 years before he passed from a heart attack in 2003. He taught me that law enforcement in a place like Millbrook County isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about understanding people, knowing their stories, and recognizing that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply listen. I thought I understood what he meant until the Morrison case showed me there were depths to this job I'd never imagined. The call that changed everything came in on October 23, 2019, at 11:47 p.m. My dispatcher, Janet Wilson, had been working the night shift for 12 years, and I could hear something different in her voice when she radioed me at home. Janet's a tough woman who raised 4 kids, mostly on her own after her husband died in that factory accident, and she doesn't rattle easily. But that night, there was an edge to her voice that made me sit up straight in my recliner. "Sheriff Bradley, we've got a domestic disturbance call at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Anonymous caller reports screaming and sounds of violence from inside the house." I knew the address immediately, the old Morrison place, a 2-story Victorian that had been built in 1894 by Theodore Morrison, who'd made his fortune in grain trading and wanted to build something grand for his new bride. The house had been the talk of the county back then, with its wraparound porch, ornate gingerbread trim, and modern conveniences like indoor plumbing and gas lighting that made it the envy of every family for miles around. The last residents had been Harold and Ethel Morrison, Theodore's great-nephew and his wife, who had both passed away in the winter of 1999 within 3 weeks of each other. Harold went first from complications related to diabetes, and Ethel followed him not long after from what the doctor called a broken heart. Their children, 2 daughters who'd moved to California back in the 70s, had never bothered to sell the property or maintain it. They'd had the utilities disconnected, boarded up some of the windows to keep vandals out, and basically left it to slowly deteriorate. The house had become one of those local landmarks that kids dared each other to approach on Halloween. Not because anyone thought it was haunted, mind you, but because abandoned places have their own kind of spookiness, especially when they're slowly being reclaimed by nature. Over the years, we'd responded to a few calls about teenagers breaking in to drink beer or couples looking for privacy. But those incidents had tapered off as the house became more deteriorated and less appealing as a party spot. "Janet, are you sure about that address? The Morrison place has been vacant for decades." "That's what I thought too, Sheriff, but..." The caller was very specific. said they could hear a man and woman fighting inside, dishes breaking, someone screaming for help. Voice sounded genuinely concerned, not like some kid playing pranks. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door, telling my wife Sarah I'd be back in an hour or so. She looked up from her book and gave me that look wives give when they sense something's not quite right. We'd been married for 28 years, and she'd developed an instinct about which calls were routine and which ones might keep me out all night. "You be careful, Tom," she said, not even looking up from her novel. "That old house gives me the creeps even in broad daylight. It was probably just kids playing pranks, or maybe some transients who had broken in looking for shelter. October nights in Illinois can get cold, and abandoned houses sometimes attract people with nowhere else to go." We'd had a few incidents over the years with homeless folks or drifters who thought an empty house would make a good place to wait out bad weather. The drive to Oakwood Drive took me through the heart of our small town. Main Street was deserted except for the fluorescent glow from Murphy's 24-hour gas station and the flickering neon sign of Betty's Diner, which had been closed since 6 o'clock. The old streetlights cast long shadows between the buildings, and I could see a few houses with their porch lights on, the blue glow of television screens visible through living room windows where families were settling in for the night. I'd made this drive thousands of times over the years, but something felt different that night. The familiar streets seemed longer, the shadows deeper. Maybe it was just the season. There's something about late October that makes everything feel a little more mysterious, a little more unsettled. The leaves were mostly gone from the trees, and the bare branches created skeletal patterns against the cloudy sky. Oakwood Drive was a tree-lined street on the older side of town, where most of the houses dated back to the early 1900s. Well-maintained homes with wraparound porches and mature oak trees that formed a canopy over the narrow road during the summer months. Now, in late fall, the street was carpeted with dead leaves that crunched under my tires as I drove slowly toward the Morrison property. The houses on Oakwood Drive represented the town's more prosperous past, when Millbrook County was a major stop on the railroad line, and local businesses were thriving. Most had been lovingly maintained by families who'd inherited them and understood their historical value. The Morrison house sat at the end of the street, separated from its neighbors by an overgrown lot on one side and a vacant field on the other. As I pulled up to the curb, my headlights illuminated the structure that had been slowly deteriorating for 2 decades. The paint was peeling in long strips. Several windows were boarded up with weathered plywood, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated debris and weather damage. The yard was overgrown with weeds and volunteer trees that had sprouted up through cracks in the concrete walkway. Ivy had begun to climb the walls, and in some places the vegetation was so thick it obscured the architectural details that had once made the house so impressive. But something was wrong with the picture. Despite its obvious abandonment, there were lights on inside the house. Not electric lights, the power had been shut off years ago, but the warm, flickering glow of what appeared to be candles or oil lamps dancing behind the dirty windows. The light was dim and inconsistent, creating moving shadows that made it look like people were moving around inside the rooms. I sat in my patrol car for a moment, studying the house and listening. The neighborhood was completely quiet except for the distant hum of traffic from the main highway and the sound of wind rustling through the bare tree branches. No sounds of fighting, no screaming, no indication of the domestic disturbance that had been reported. I radioed Janet to confirm the details of the call. The caller didn't leave a name, she told me. Called from a block number. Said they were walking their dog and heard the commotion from inside the house. Described it as a man and woman arguing loudly, things being thrown around, someone crying for help. How long ago did the call come in? About 20 minutes ago. I tried to call back to get more details, but the number was blocked. Should I try to trace it? Don't worry about it for now. I'm here and I'll check it out. If I need backup, I'll let you know. I got out of the car and approached the front door, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The wooden porch steps creaked under my weight, and I could smell the musty odor of decay and neglect that clings to abandoned buildings. There were signs of small animals, probably raccoons or opossums, that had been using the porch for shelter. Leaves had accumulated in the corners, and spider webs stretched between the ceiling beams. As I reached for the front door, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The door was slightly ajar, not just unlocked, but actually open about 3 inches, as if someone had recently entered or exited without bothering to close it properly. After 20 years of abandonment, that door should have been sealed shut by weather, rust, and debris. I drew my service weapon and called out, "Sheriff's Department." Anyone inside needs to come out with their hands visible. No response. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees and the distant rumble of a freight train passing through town several miles away. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight revealing a scene that defied explanation. The interior of the house was not the gutted, vandalized shell I had expected. Instead, it looked as if the Morrison family had just stepped out for the evening. The entryway was clean and well-maintained, with a coat rack holding what appeared to be recently worn jackets and a small table with a bowl for keys and mail. Furniture covered with dust sheets filled the living room, but underneath the coverings, I could see the shapes of well-preserved antiques. Family photographs still hung on the walls in their original frames, and a grandfather clock in the corner had stopped at 3:17, though whether that was AM or PM, I couldn't tell. The air inside the house didn't carry the stale, musty smell I would have expected from a building that had been closed up for 20 years. Instead, it smelled like cleaning products and furniture polish, as if someone had been maintaining the place regularly. But the most unsettling detail was the dining room table, clearly visible through an archway to my left. It was set for 2 people with china plates, silverware, and cloth napkins that looked like they'd been pressed recently. 2 chairs were pulled back from the table, as if the diners had just stood up. In the center of the table, a candle burned in a brass holder, casting dancing shadows on the walls and ceiling. I called for backup on my radio, knowing it would take at least 15 minutes for another unit to arrive. While I waited, I began a systematic search of the house, starting with the ground floor. Every room I entered showed the same impossible signs of recent occupation. The kitchen was perhaps the most disturbing. It showed clear signs of recent use. Dishes in the sink that appeared to have been used for a meal, food remnants on plates, a pot on the stove that was still warm to the touch. The refrigerator hummed quietly, which should have been impossible since the electricity had been disconnected years earlier. When I opened it, I found fresh groceries, milk, eggs, lunch meat, vegetables that showed no signs of spoilage. I picked up the milk carton and checked the expiration date. According to the label, it should have spoiled 3 days earlier. Yet, when I opened it and smelled the contents, the milk was perfectly fresh. The same was true for the other perishables. Everything in the refrigerator appeared to be fresh and recently purchased, despite the fact that no one should have been living in the house. The living room appeared frozen in time, but not in the way I would have expected from an abandoned house. Magazines from 1999 were scattered on the coffee table, but they looked like they had been read recently. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay next to a pencil, with several answers filled in with fresh ink. An old television set dominated one corner of the room, and when I approached it, I could see that it was actually turned on, displaying a local news broadcast with the volume turned low. I tried the light switches out of a habit, knowing the power was disconnected, but was startled when several lamps actually turned on. The bulbs glowed with warm, steady light, illuminating the room and revealing details I had missed in the beam of my flashlight. The house appeared to be fully powered, despite the utility company's insistence that service had been disconnected in January 2000. Deputy Mike Stevens arrived as I was examining the first floor. Mike had been with the department for 8 years and was one of my most reliable officers. A former military police officer who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, he wasn't easily rattled by unusual situations. But when he walked into that house and saw what I was seeing, I watched his face go pale. "Sheriff, this is impossible," he said, looking around the living room with its glowing lamps and obvious signs of recent habitation. I drove past this place last week during my patrol, and it was definitely empty. Boarded up windows, no power, no activity. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. "I know, Mike. That's what makes this so strange. Everything in here suggests that someone has been living here recently. Not just squatting, but actually maintaining the place as if it were their permanent home." We continued our search together, moving to the second floor. The staircase was solid and well-maintained, with no creaking boards or signs of structural damage that I would have expected from a house that had been vacant for 20 years. At the top of the stairs, a hallway stretched toward the back of the house, with doors leading to what appeared to be 3 bedrooms and a bathroom. The master bedroom contained a bed that appeared to have been recently slept in. The covers were turned back on both sides. Pillows showed clear head impressions, and there was a glass of water on each nightstand. The water glasses were half empty, with no signs of evaporation or dust that should have accumulated if they had been sitting there for any length of time. In the closet, we found men's and women's clothing hanging neatly on wooden hangers. The clothes appeared to be from different eras. Some looked vintage, dating back to the 1960s and 1970s, while others appeared much more contemporary. All were clean and well-maintained, as if they had been recently laundered and pressed. The second bedroom had been converted into what appeared to be a home office. A desk held papers and documents, including what looked like recent utility bills and bank statements. I picked up one of the bills and examined it carefully. It was addressed to Harold Morrison at 1247 Oakwood Drive and dated just 3 weeks earlier. The bill was from the electric company, showing normal residential usage for the previous month. Deputy Stevens picked up another document from the desk. "Sheriff, look at this gas bill. It's also dated this month, and it's addressed to Harold Morrison at this address." I examined the gas bill myself. It appeared genuine, complete with usage charts and payment due dates. According to the document, the house was currently consuming utilities at normal residential levels. But I knew for a fact that both electric and gas service to this address had been disconnected in January 2000, shortly after the Morrison couple's deaths. In the bathroom, we found more evidence of recent occupation. Toiletries were arranged on the counter, toothbrushes, soap, shampoo, medications. A damp towel hung on the rack, and the mirror showed signs of recent use, with water spots that suggested someone had been washing their face or brushing their teeth within the past few hours. The medicine cabinet contained prescription bottles with Harold Morrison's name and recent dates. I picked up one of the bottles and read the label. It was for diabetes medication, prescribed just 2 months earlier by Dr. Franklin Hayes, who had been Harold's physician before his death in 1999. The bottle was nearly empty, suggesting it had been used regularly according to the prescribed dosage. By this time, my radio was crackling with dispatch communications. Other officers were beginning to arrive, and I could hear Janet trying to reach the utility companies to verify service status to the address. The response she received only deepened the mystery. "Sheriff, I've got 3 different utility companies on the line." Janet's voice came through my radio. "Electric, gas, and water all show active service to 1247 Oakwood Drive under the name Harold Morrison. They have records of monthly payments being made automatically from a bank account. But when I called the bank, they said Harold Morrison's account was closed in 2000 after his death. Deputy Stevens and I exchanged glances. We were dealing with something far beyond a simple trespassing case or even an elaborate hoax. Someone had been living in this house, paying utilities under a dead man's name, and maintaining the fiction that a couple who had been buried for 20 years were still residing at this address. Janet, I need you to contact the power company and ask them to send a technician out here to verify the electrical connection. Also, call the gas company and have them check their service lines to this address. I want to understand how this house is receiving utilities when the service was supposedly disconnected 20 years ago. Already on it, Sheriff. They're sending someone out, but it won't be until morning. The utility companies are as confused as we are. We completed our search of the house without finding any current occupants, but the evidence of recent habitation was overwhelming. Fresh food in the refrigerator, clean dishes in the sink, a newspaper from that morning folded neatly on the kitchen counter. In the living room, the television was tuned to a local news station, and the volume was set at a comfortable listening level. Most disturbing was the discovery of personal items that suggested the Morrison couple's daily routines had never been interrupted. Harold's reading glasses sat on the arm of his favorite chair, with a bookmark saving his place in a novel that had been published just 6 months earlier. Ethel's knitting basket contained a partially completed sweater in a pattern that was currently popular, with yarn that looked freshly purchased. Around 2 a.m., while we were documenting the scene and waiting for crime scene technicians to arrive, we heard sounds from upstairs. Footsteps moving across the floor, the creak of bed springs, the sound of running water in the bathroom. Deputy Stevens and I immediately headed upstairs, weapons drawn. We found nothing. The house was as empty as it had been during our initial search. But the bed that had been neatly made when we first entered was now unmade, with clear impressions of 2 people having lain in it. The pillows were arranged differently, and the covers were pulled back as if someone had just gotten up. In the bathroom, we found evidence that someone had recently used the facilities. The toilet seat was up, which it hadn't been during our earlier examination. Fresh water in the sink basin suggested someone had washed their hands. The towel that had been hanging neatly on the rack was now slightly askew, as if it had been used and hastily replaced. I called for additional backup and established a perimeter around the house. Over the next 6 hours, we documented dozens of similar incidents. Sounds of activity from rooms we'd just cleared, evidence of meals being prepared in the kitchen while we stood guard in the living room, voices having quiet conversations that stopped the moment we approached to investigate. The strangest incident occurred around 4 a.m. when Deputy Stevens was standing guard in the kitchen while I was upstairs checking the bedrooms. He radioed me to report that someone was cooking breakfast. He could smell bacon frying and coffee brewing. When I came downstairs, I found the stove warm and a frying pan that showed signs of recent use, but no food and no one in the kitchen. Sheriff, I swear someone was cooking in here, Stevens said, his voice carrying a note of confusion I'd never heard from him before. I could smell the food, hear the sizzling in the pan, even heard someone humming while they cooked. But when I turned around to look, nobody was there. The crime scene technicians arrived at dawn and began processing the house for fingerprints, DNA evidence, and any other clues that might explain what we were experiencing. What they found defied logical explanation. The house contained fingerprints from Harold and Ethel Morrison throughout every room. Fresh prints, not decades-old impressions that had somehow survived 20 years of abandonment. The prints were found on surfaces that showed recent cleaning, and on objects that couldn't have been in the house when the couple died. Hair samples recovered from the master bedroom matched DNA from the Morrison family medical records that we obtained from their former physician, Dr. Hayes. The samples showed no signs of degradation that would be expected from hair that was 20 years old. Instead, the DNA was fresh and viable, as if it had been deposited recently. Even more disturbing was the discovery of recent photographs scattered throughout the house. In the living room, we found family pictures that included Harold and Ethel Morrison, but also showed them with people who appeared to be current residents of the town. Neighbors who were very much alive, town council members, local business owners. The photographs showed recent events, the county fair from last summer, the Memorial Day parade, Christmas celebrations from the previous year. One photograph particularly caught my attention. It showed Harold and Ethel Morrison standing with Mayor Janet Collins and several other city officials at what appeared to be a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new library expansion that had been completed just 3 months earlier. I had been at that ceremony myself, and I was certain the Morrison couple had not been present. Yet there they were in the photograph, smiling and looking exactly as they had 20 years earlier, but wearing contemporary clothing. I began interviewing people who appeared in these photographs. The responses I received were consistent and deeply unsettling. Yes, they remembered Harold and Ethel Morrison. Nice couple, very involved in community activities. They had seen them recently at various local events. Bethany Jenkins, who owned the flower shop on Main Street, insisted she had sold flowers to Ethel Morrison just the previous week. She comes in every Tuesday for fresh arrangements, always pays in cash, always asks about my grandchildren. Such a sweet lady. She was just in yesterday looking for some chrysanthemums for her dining room table. When I showed Bethany a photograph of Ethel Morrison from 1999, she confirmed it was the same woman who had been shopping in her store regularly. That's definitely her, though she looks a little older now than she does in that picture. Her hair's gone completely gray, and she uses a walking stick now because of her arthritis. Cornelius Murphy, who ran the gas station on Main Street, claimed Harold Morrison was one of his regular customers. Comes in every Thursday morning, around 8 a.m. to fill up that old 1995 Buick of his. We talk about the weather, the crops, normal small-town conversation. He always pays cash and usually buys a cup of coffee and a newspaper. I served him just yesterday morning. The local bank manager, Lucinda Hendricks, showed me records of regular transactions from Harold Morrison's account, an account that according to corporate records had been closed for 20 years. Yet the local branch showed continuous activity, monthly utility payments, cash withdrawals, even recent deposits. I've been handling their account personally for 15 years, Lucinda told me when I visited the bank to verify the information. They're model customers, always polite, never any problems. Harold was just in on Friday to make a deposit. He brought in cash from what he said was the sale of some antiques. I was facing a situation that challenged everything I understood about reality. An entire community was maintaining detailed, consistent relationships with two people who had died 2 decades earlier. Either I was dealing with the most elaborate conspiracy in law enforcement history, or something far more unsettling was happening in Millbrook County. The investigation expanded to include state police and eventually FBI investigators who specialized in unusual cases. For weeks, teams of experts examined every aspect of the Morrison house and interviewed dozens of local residents. The findings were consistent but impossible to explain through conventional means. The house showed clear evidence of continuous occupation by Harold and Ethel Morrison. Their personal effects, their routines, their interactions with the community had never stopped, despite their documented deaths in 1999. Utility companies had records of payments being made automatically from bank accounts that should have been closed. Local businesses had records of transactions with customers who should have been dead. Yet medical records confirmed that both Harold and Ethel Morrison had died of natural causes in the winter of 1999 and had been cremated at the county funeral home. Death certificates had been filed with the state. Estates had been settled through probate court, and their children had attended funeral services before returning to California. Dr. Ophelia Martinez, a forensic psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the case, spent weeks interviewing community members who claimed to have regular contact with the Morrison couple. Her findings were disturbing. What we're seeing isn't mass delusion or collective false memory, Dr. Martinez explained during a case conference. These people have genuine, detailed, ongoing relationships with individuals who are demonstrably deceased. They can describe recent conversations, changes in appearance over time, current events discussed with the Morrisons. The level of detail and consistency is remarkable. She had conducted psychological evaluations on 12 residents who claimed regular contact with the Morrison couple. All were mentally healthy individuals with no history of psychiatric illness, substance abuse, or neurological conditions that might cause hallucinations or false memories. The most puzzling aspect, Dr. Martinez continued, is that their descriptions of the Morrisons include age-appropriate changes. They describe Harold as more frail than he was 20 years ago, walking with a slight limp, having difficulty with his vision. They describe Ethel as having developed arthritis, using a walking stick, her hair having gone completely gray. These aren't static memories of people frozen in time. They're descriptions of individuals who have continued to age and develop health issues consistent with their advanced years. 3 months into the investigation, we made another discovery that deepened the mystery. While reviewing old police reports, I found records of similar calls to 1247 Oakwood Drive dating back to 2005. Domestic disturbances, wellness checks, noise complaints, all reporting activity at a house that was supposed to be empty. Each time, responding officers had found the house vacant and secured. Their reports described boarded windows, no power, no signs of habitation. Yet they had all been responding to calls about activity inside the house. Arguments, loud music, parties, even complaints about someone mowing the lawn too early in the morning. I pulled the personnel files on those officers. Of the 8 who had responded to calls at the Morrison address over the years, 5 had left the department within months of their visits to the house. 2 had moved away from Millbrook County entirely, and 1 had taken early retirement citing health concerns. I tracked down former Deputy Wilhelmina Walsh, who had responded to 3 separate calls at the Morrison house between 2007 and 2009. She had moved to Oregon after leaving the department but agreed to speak with me by phone. "I never talked about what I saw in that house," she told me, her voice carrying a note of relief at finally being able to discuss the experience. My supervisor thought I was having some kind of breakdown when I tried to file my reports. But Sheriff Bradley, I saw them. Harold and Ethel Morrison. They were living in that house, cooking dinner, watching television, going about their normal lives just like any elderly couple. Wilhelmina described interactions identical to what we were currently experiencing. Lights in the house, sounds of activity, evidence of recent occupation. But when she tried to document her findings or bring in other officers, the house would return to its abandoned state. It was like the house knew when I was coming alone versus when I had backup, she explained. When I was by myself, I could see everything clearly. The furniture, the lights. Sometimes I could even see Harold and Ethel through the windows. The moment I brought another officer or tried to take photographs, everything would disappear. This revelation prompted me to conduct an experiment. I began making regular visits to the Morrison house alone, without backup, without official documentation. What I discovered changed my understanding of the case entirely. When I approached the house alone, particularly during evening hours, it was fully occupied. Harold and Ethel Morrison lived there exactly as their neighbors described. I could see them through the windows, moving about their daily routines. The house was clean, well-maintained, and showed all the signs of active habitation. Sometimes they would wave to me from the front porch or invite me in for coffee. The conversations I had with them were normal, mundane discussions about the weather, local events, their garden. They complained about teenagers cutting through their yard, discussed their concerns about the county's budget problems, asked about my family. They aged appropriately. Harold's hair was completely gray now, and he walked with a slight stoop that hadn't been there in old photographs. Ethel had developed arthritis in her hands and moved more slowly than she had in her younger years. They adapted to changing technology, commenting on how much they enjoyed the new digital cable service and asking my advice about whether they should get a computer. But the moment I tried to bring other officers or document our interactions, the house would return to its abandoned state. Phone calls would be disconnected. Photographs would show only an empty structure. Audio recordings would contain only static and wind noise. After dozens of these solo visits, I began to understand the parameters of what was happening. Harold and Ethel Morrison existed in a state that was real but selective. They could interact with the community, maintain relationships, conduct business, live normal lives, but only when observed individually, never when scrutinized collectively. The domestic disturbance calls that had initially brought us to the house, I realized, were coming from Harold and Ethel themselves. Not because they were fighting with each other, but because they were trying to get someone's attention. They were trapped in an existence that was real but fragile, unable to prove their reality to anyone who might help them understand their situation. During one of my private visits in January 2020, I asked Harold directly about their circumstances. His answer haunts me to this day. "Sheriff Bradley, we know we died," he said, sitting in his favorite armchair with a cup of coffee warming his hands. "We remember the funerals, the cremation, our children grieving. We remember the pain of leaving everything behind, but we also know we're here, living, breathing, thinking, feeling. We can't explain it any better than you can." Ethel nodded from her position on the sofa, where she was working on a knitting project. "We just know that as long as people believe in us individually, we can continue to exist. When too many people look for us at once, when you bring cameras and equipment and investigators, we start to fade. It's like we need faith instead of proof to maintain our existence." I pressed them for more details about their deaths and their current state. Harold explained that they had both died peacefully in their sleep during the severe winter storm of 1999. They remembered their deaths clearly, the gradual slowing of their heartbeats, the growing cold, the sense of consciousness fading. "But then, we woke up the next morning, and everything was normal again," Harold continued. "We were in our bedroom, it was warm, we could hear birds singing outside. We got up, made breakfast, went about our day. It wasn't until we tried to attend our own funeral services that we realized something was wrong." They described watching their funeral from the back of the church, seeing their children mourn, hearing the eulogies delivered by friends and neighbors. But when they tried to approach their family members or the funeral director, they were ignored completely. It was as if they were invisible. "We went home that day and tried to understand what had happened to us," Ethel said, setting down her knitting to look directly at me. "The house was empty. Our furniture was gone. Our belongings had been removed by our daughters. But as we sat there remembering how things used to be, the house gradually returned to normal. Our furniture reappeared. Our photographs came back. Everything returned to the way it was when we were alive. Over time, they learned they could maintain their existence through the belief and memory of others. When neighbors remembered them fondly, when business owners expected their regular visits, when the community included them in their mental picture of daily life, Harold and Ethel could continue to exist and interact with the world. But the moment too many people tried to prove their existence scientifically or document their presence officially, the belief structure that sustained them would collapse and they would fade back into death. "It's not that we're ghosts or spirits," Harold explained. "We're just people who found a way to stay connected to the place we love. As long as the community remembers us and accepts us as part of daily life, we can continue to be here." This understanding created an impossible situation for me as sheriff. I had 2 people living in my jurisdiction who were both legally dead and provably alive. They were committing no crimes, paying their bills through mechanisms I couldn't explain, contributing to the community's welfare, and asking only to be allowed to continue the lives they had been forced to leave behind. After extensive discussions with state authorities and federal investigators, I made the decision to classify the Morrison case as closed, citing insufficient evidence of criminal activity. The FBI investigators were frustrated, but eventually moved on to other cases. The state police filed their reports and returned to their regular duties. But I continued my private visits to 1247 Oakwood Drive. Harold and Ethel Morrison remain residents of Millbrook County, living their quiet lives, maintaining their garden, participating in community events when observed individually. They age slowly but noticeably. Their health declines gradually. They adapt to changing technology and social customs. The utility companies continue to receive their payments from an account that officially doesn't exist. Local businesses serve them as regular customers. Neighbors wave to them on the street and invite them to barbecues and birthday parties. The Morrison couple has become integrated into the community's daily life in ways that most people don't even notice. They attend church services, where they sit in the back pew and leave quietly before anyone can approach them for extended conversation. They shop at the grocery store during off-peak hours, always paying cash and exchanging pleasantries with cashiers who remember them as longtime customers. Sometimes, late at night when I'm driving past their house, I see them sitting on their front porch watching the street. They wave to me, and I wave back. We maintain the fiction that everything is normal, that they're just another elderly couple enjoying their retirement in small-town Illinois. But I know the truth. Harold and Ethel Morrison are sustained by the collective memory and belief of a community that refuses to let them go. They exist in the space between life and death, reality and imagination, fact and faith. The official record shows that 1247 Oakwood Drive is vacant property that has been abandoned for over 20 years. The unofficial reality is that it's home to 2 people who love their community so much that they found a way to return from death to continue being part of it. I've never filed another official report about the Morrison house. I've never brought other officers there for investigations. I've learned that some truths are too fragile to withstand scrutiny, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Every few months, I receive calls about domestic disturbances at 1247 Oakwood Drive. I always respond personally, always alone. I knock on the door, have coffee with Harold and Ethel, listen to their concerns about neighborhood noise or suspicious activities they've observed. I file reports about unfounded complaints and return to my regular duties. Because sometimes the most important part of law enforcement isn't solving crimes or gathering evidence. Sometimes it's protecting the things that make our communities special, even when those things can't be explained or documented or proved. Harold and Ethel Morrison are good people who found a way to stay with the community they love, and as long as I'm sheriff of Millbrook County, Their secret is safe with me. But the Morrison case opened my eyes to other mysteries that had been hiding in plain sight throughout our county. Once I understood that reality could be more flexible than I'd ever imagined, I began noticing other anomalies that I'd previously dismissed as coincidence or explained away with rational reasoning. In the spring of 2020, I received a call from Martha Whitfield, who owned a small antique shop on Elm Street. She reported that someone had been rearranging items in her store overnight, but nothing was ever stolen. When I investigated, I found that the rearranged items were always placed in configurations that made more historical sense. Civil War artifacts grouped with appropriate documentation, family photographs arranged chronologically, furniture pieces positioned as they would have been in their original homes. Martha's shop specialized in estate sales and local historical artifacts. What I discovered was that the overnight rearrangements were being done by previous owners of the items, people who had died years or decades earlier, but maintained such strong connections to their possessions that they couldn't resist organizing them properly. I began spending time in Martha's shop during late evening hours, and I witnessed these former owners working carefully to preserve and present their belongings correctly. An elderly man who had died in 2003 would adjust the positioning of his father's military medals. A woman who had passed away in 2015 would carefully dust and rearrange the china set that had been her grandmother's pride and joy. They never spoke to me directly, but they would nod politely if our eyes met. They treated the antique shop as a kind of museum where their family histories were being preserved, and they took their curatorial responsibilities seriously. Similar phenomena began appearing throughout Millbrook County once I knew what to look for. The cemetery groundskeeper, Clarence Gentry, mentioned that flowers were being placed on graves by people he never saw. Fresh arrangements would appear overnight on the graves of people who had no living relatives in the area. When I investigated, I found that family members who had died were returning to tend the graves of their parents, spouses, and children. The local library reported books being reshelved in perfect order each morning, despite the fact that librarian Margaret Folsom was certain she had left them in disarray the previous evening. I discovered that former librarians, women who had dedicated their lives to organizing and preserving knowledge, were continuing their work after death, unable to rest while books remained improperly categorized. At the elementary school, janitor Robert Hayes reported that classrooms were being cleaned overnight by people he could sometimes glimpse in his peripheral vision, but never see directly. Former teachers were returning to ensure that their classrooms remained pristine environments for learning. Each of these instances followed the same pattern as the Morrison case. The deceased individuals could maintain their activities as long as they weren't subjected to intense scrutiny or scientific observation. They existed in the spaces between official documentation and community memory, sustained by the collective belief that good people continue to care for the things they loved in life. I began to understand that Millbrook County had become a place where death wasn't necessarily final. People who had deep connections to the community, who had invested their lives in making it a better place, found ways to continue their service even after their hearts stopped beating. This understanding completely changed how I approached my duties as sheriff. I was no longer just enforcing laws among the living. I was protecting a delicate ecosystem of existence that included people who existed in multiple states of being. The Morrison house became the most visible example of this phenomenon, but it was far from the only one. Throughout the county, I began documenting other instances of impossible occupation. The old Miller farm, which had been abandoned since 1987, showed signs of someone continuing to care for the livestock that had died decades earlier. Neighbors reported seeing lights in the barn and hearing the sounds of feeding time, but investigation revealed only empty stalls and rusted equipment. The Riverside Cemetery became a focal point of activity. Families who had been buried there for generations continued to maintain their plots, hold quiet conversations across grave sites, and welcome newly deceased relatives with ceremonies that living family members never witnessed. The cemetery existed simultaneously as a place of rest for the dead and a community center for those who had found ways to remain active after death. Dr. Martinez returned to Millbrook County several times to study these expanded phenomena. Her research revealed that what we were experiencing was unique in the field of paranormal psychology. Most reports of ghostly activity involved individual spirits appearing sporadically and unpredictably. What was happening in Millbrook County was systematic and community-wide. An entire population of deceased residents who had organized themselves into a parallel society that coexisted with the living. The Morrison case appears to be just the most visible manifestation of something much larger, Dr. Martinez explained during one of her follow-up visits. You have an entire shadow community of people who have found ways to remain connected to this place after death. They maintain relationships with each other, continue their life's work, and participate in community activities. It's unprecedented in the literature. Her research also revealed why Millbrook County had become a focal point for this type of activity. The community's strong social bonds, its resistance to rapid change, and its emphasis on family history and local tradition had created ideal conditions for people to maintain connections after death. Communities that value continuity and tradition provide better anchoring points for this type of phenomenon, Dr. Martinez theorized. When people are deeply invested in place and community, when they see themselves as part of something larger than their individual lives, they're more likely to find ways to remain connected after death. The federal investigators who had initially been involved in the Morrison case eventually classified the entire situation under a program that I wasn't allowed to discuss publicly. They established protocols for monitoring the situation and provided me with contact information for specialists who could provide assistance if the phenomena ever became problematic. But problematic was never the right word for what was happening in Millbrook County. The deceased residents were model citizens. They committed no crimes, caused no disturbances, and generally made positive contributions to community life. They helped maintain historical buildings, assisted with community events, and provided a sense of continuity that strengthened the social fabric of the county. The only challenges came from outsiders who learned about the situation and wanted to investigate or exploit it. I became expert at discouraging paranormal investigators, academic researchers, and curiosity seekers who might disrupt the delicate balance that allowed the deceased residents to maintain their existence. Over the years, I developed an informal network of communication with the shadow community. While I couldn't interact with them as freely as I could with Harold and Ethel Morrison, I learned to interpret signs and signals that indicated when they needed assistance or had information that might be helpful to my law enforcement duties. Former sheriff deputies continued to patrol the county after death, providing additional eyes and ears for security concerns. Former merchants helped protect local businesses from vandalism and theft. Former teachers assisted with school safety issues. The deceased residents had organized themselves into a support system that complemented the official law enforcement structure. This partnership proved invaluable during several major incidents. When a group of methamphetamine dealers attempted to establish operations in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, they were driven away by phenomena they couldn't explain. Equipment failures, mysterious sounds, feelings of being watched. I later learned that former factory workers who had died in the 1980s had organized to protect their former workplace from being used for illegal activities. During a severe winter storm in 2021 that knocked out power to most of the county, several elderly residents reported receiving assistance from neighbors they thought had died years earlier. People found their driveways cleared of snow, their heating systems mysteriously repaired, and supplies of food and water delivered to their porches overnight. The deceased residents had mobilized to ensure that living community members were safe during the emergency. The annual county fair became a particularly interesting event. Deceased residents who had been involved in organizing the fair during their lifetimes continued to participate in setup and coordination. Vendor booths would be perfectly arranged overnight. Electrical problems would be mysteriously resolved, and lost children would be guided back to their parents by people who disappeared when anyone tried to thank them directly. As my understanding of the situation deepened, I began to appreciate the profound implications of what was happening in Millbrook County. Death, as we traditionally understood it, wasn't the end of community membership. People who had invested their lives in building and maintaining the community found ways to continue that work even after their biological functions ceased. This created a unique form of social continuity. Instead of losing the wisdom and experience of community elders when they died, Millbrook County retained access to generations of knowledge and expertise. Former doctors continued to provide informal health advice. Former teachers helped with educational challenges. Former business owners shared insights about economic development. The community's decision-making processes became enriched by input from people who had decades or centuries of experience with local issues. While the deceased residents couldn't vote in elections or hold official positions, their influence on community discussions was significant and generally positive. Harold and Ethel Morrison, as the most visible representatives of the shadow community, served as unofficial ambassadors between the living and the dead. During my regular visits to their house, they would sometimes relay concerns or suggestions from other deceased residents. They helped mediate disputes between living and dead community members when someone's activities were causing disruption. For example, when the city council was debating whether to allow a large retail chain to build a store on the site of the old courthouse, Harold informed me that several former judges and city officials were strongly opposed to the plan. They had organized to make their displeasure known through minor but persistent problems: construction equipment that wouldn't start, permits that were mysteriously delayed, survey markers that moved overnight. I was able to facilitate a community meeting where living residents discussed the development proposal with full knowledge that their deceased neighbors had strong opinions about the issue. The result was a compromise that preserved the historical character of the town square while allowing for appropriate economic development. These collaborations between living and dead residents became a regular part of my duties as sheriff. I learned to interpret signs of supernatural intervention in community affairs and to facilitate communication between different constituencies when conflicts arose. The most challenging aspect of managing this situation was maintaining secrecy about the true nature of what was happening in Millbrook County. Federal authorities had made it clear that public knowledge of the phenomena could attract unwanted attention and potentially disrupt the delicate conditions that allowed the deceased residents to maintain their existence. I developed cover stories for unusual incidents, training my deputies to describe supernatural interventions as coincidences or natural phenomena. When equipment failed mysteriously, we blamed technical malfunctions. When problems were solved overnight by unknown helpers, we credited concerned citizens who preferred to remain anonymous. This required careful coordination with other community leaders who were aware of the situation. Mayor Janet Collins, who had been briefed on the full scope of the phenomena, helped ensure that city government policies didn't inadvertently disrupt the shadow community's activities. Dr. Hayes, who had continued as the community's primary physician, learned to treat health concerns that involved both living and deceased residents. The local newspaper, the Millbrook Gazette, was owned by editor Franklin Pierce, whose grandfather had founded the paper in 1923. Franklin became aware of the situation when his grandfather began leaving edited versions of articles on his desk overnight. improving the historical accuracy and local context of stories about community events. Rather than exposing the phenomenon, Franklin chose to protect it by carefully managing how unusual incidents were reported. His articles about mysterious community improvements and unexplained acts of kindness helped reinforce the community's positive perception of the supernatural activity without revealing its true nature. Local clergy also played important roles in maintaining the balance between living and dead residents. Pastor Williams at the First Methodist Church found that his congregation included people who had died decades earlier, but continued to attend services. He learned to deliver sermons that addressed the spiritual needs of both living and deceased parishioners, focusing on themes of community, continuity, and service. Father Rodriguez at St. Mary's Catholic Church faced similar challenges when deceased parishioners continued to participate in religious activities. He developed a pastoral approach that honored their continued devotion while maintaining the theological integrity of Catholic doctrine about life after death. The interfaith cooperation that developed around these issues strengthened religious life throughout the county. Living residents gained a deeper appreciation for the spiritual dimensions of community membership, while deceased residents found ways to continue their faith practices in their new state of existence. Educational institutions also adapted to accommodate the reality of ongoing involvement by deceased community members. The high school history teacher, Ms. Anderson, found that her lessons about local history were being supplemented by detailed notes that appeared on her desk overnight, written by people who had lived through the events she was teaching. Rather than being disturbed by this assistance, Ms. Anderson embraced it as an opportunity to provide her students with primary source accounts of historical events. Her history classes became renowned throughout the state for their accuracy and depth, though she was careful never to reveal the true source of her supplementary materials. The elementary school librarian, Mrs. Hendricks, discovered that storytime sessions were being attended by children who had died in previous decades but continued to enjoy hearing tales read aloud. She learned to read to a mixed audience of living and dead children, selecting books that would appeal to young people from different time periods. These educational collaborations enriched the learning environment while helping to preserve community history and cultural traditions. Students gained access to knowledge and perspectives that would have been lost forever if not for the continued involvement of deceased community members. As the years passed, the phenomena in Millbrook County became more sophisticated and organized. The shadow community developed its own leadership structure, with former elected officials helping to coordinate activities and resolve disputes among deceased residents. Harold Morrison emerged as an unofficial mayor of the shadow community, partly because his house was the most visible example of the phenomena, and partly because of his natural leadership abilities. During my visits, he would brief me on issues affecting deceased residents and help coordinate responses to problems that required collaboration between living and dead community members. Ethel Morrison became the shadow community's social coordinator, organizing events and activities that allowed deceased residents to maintain relationships with each other and stay connected to community life. She helped newly deceased residents adjust to their altered state of existence and learn how to participate in community activities without causing disruption. The shadow community developed its own informal economy based on service and reciprocity rather than monetary exchange. Deceased residents contributed their skills and knowledge to community projects in exchange for the social connection and sense of purpose that sustained their continued existence. Former craftsmen continued to create beautiful objects that would mysteriously appear in locations where they would be appreciated. Former musicians played concerts that only certain people could hear. Former artists created works that existed in the spaces between perception and imagination. These cultural contributions enriched the artistic life of Millbrook County while providing deceased residents with outlets for creative expression. The community developed a reputation for having an unusually vibrant cultural scene, though visitors could never quite identify what made the local arts community so special. The agricultural sector also benefited from continued involvement by deceased farmers who had spent their lives learning how to work the local soil and climate conditions. Crops grew more successfully when former landowners continued to provide guidance about planting, cultivation, and harvesting techniques. Living farmers learned to interpret signs and signals from their deceased predecessors, leading to improved yields and more sustainable farming practices. The county's agricultural productivity increased significantly, though agricultural extension agents could never fully explain the improvements in scientific terms. Environmental conservation efforts were supported by former residents who had deep knowledge of local ecosystems and wildlife patterns. They helped protect sensitive habitats from development, guided conservation efforts to focus on the most critical areas, and assisted with wildlife management programs. The State Environmental Agency praised Millbrook County for its outstanding conservation achievements, never realizing that much of the success was due to guidance from people who had been observing and protecting the local environment for generations after their deaths. As my tenure as sheriff extended into its second decade, I came to understand that what was happening in Millbrook County represented a fundamental shift in how communities could function. The boundary between life and death had become permeable, allowing for continuity of relationships and institutional knowledge that exceeded anything possible in conventional communities. This created both opportunities and responsibilities. The opportunity lay in access to wisdom and experience that spanned generations. Deceased residents could provide guidance based on decades or centuries of observation and participation in community life. They offered perspectives that no living person could match. The responsibility lay in protecting this unique situation from forces that might disrupt or exploit it. As the years passed, I became increasingly aware that what we had in Millbrook County was fragile and precious. It required constant vigilance to maintain the conditions that allowed living and dead residents to coexist harmoniously. Federal oversight of the situation continued through periodic visits from specialists who monitored the phenomena for signs of instability or expansion beyond manageable parameters. These visits were always conducted discreetly, with agents posing as routine administrative inspectors or academic researchers. The message from federal authorities was consistent. As long as the phenomena remained contained within Millbrook County and didn't cause problems for the broader region, local management of the situation would be supported. But any indication that the effects were spreading or becoming uncontrollable would trigger more direct intervention. This created pressure to maintain strict boundaries around the phenomena, while ensuring that deceased residents felt welcome and valued within the community. It was a delicate balance that required constant attention and occasional difficult decisions. Some deceased residents attempted to contact family members who had moved away from Millbrook County, creating risks that the phenomena might spread to other locations. I had to work with Harold and Ethel Morrison to establish protocols that discouraged such contact while respecting the emotional needs of deceased residents who missed their relocated relatives. Other deceased residents became too aggressive in their involvement with community affairs, creating visible disturbances that threatened to expose the true nature of what was happening. These situations required intervention to help the individuals adjust their behavior to more sustainable patterns of participation. The most challenging cases involved deceased residents who had difficulty accepting the limitations of their altered state of existence. Some attempted to resume their former occupations in ways that would have been impossible to conceal. Others tried to re-establish family relationships that could no longer function normally. These situations required careful counseling and support to help the individuals find appropriate ways to channel their energies and maintain their connections to the community. Harold and Ethel Morrison played crucial roles in these interventions, Serving as mentors, former law enforcement officers helped police deceased residents who violated community standards. Former social workers provided counseling and support services. Former judges mediated disputes and established precedents for resolving conflicts. This parallel justice system operated according to principles that balanced individual needs with community welfare, but it functioned through persuasion and social pressure rather than formal sanctions. Deceased residents who couldn't adapt to appropriate patterns of behavior would gradually lose their connection to the community and fade back into final death. As I approached my 20th year as sheriff, I reflected on how profoundly the Morrison case had changed my understanding of law enforcement and community service. What had begun as a routine domestic disturbance call had revealed layers of reality that challenged every assumption I had held about life, death, and the nature of human community. Millbrook County had become something unique in the world, a place where the bonds between people transcended biological existence, where community membership continued beyond death, where the wisdom of generations remained accessible to guide current decisions and future planning. The house on Oakwood Drive continued to exist in its strange state of living abandonment, serving as a visible symbol of the broader phenomena that had transformed our entire county. During the day, it appeared empty and neglected to casual observers. But as evening approached and individual community members passed by, lights would begin to flicker in the windows. Smoke would rise from the chimney, and the sound of quiet conversation would drift across the yard. Harold and Ethel Morrison remained the most accessible representatives of the shadow community, continuing their quiet lives while serving as bridges between living and dead residents. They aged slowly but noticeably, their health declining gradually in ways that mirrored the natural aging process, but extended it far beyond normal human lifespan. Neighbors still saw Harold working in his garden during early morning hours when individual observers were likely to be present. Ethel could still be glimpsed hanging laundry on the line or tending to her flower beds. Local business owners continued to serve them as regular customers, accepting their presence as a normal part of community life. The community had learned to sustain them through belief, memory, and the simple human refusal to let go of good people, even after death had claimed them. They existed in the space between heartbeats, between breaths, between moments of doubt and certainty. I sometimes wonder if there are other Millbrook counties in other parts of America, other communities where people loved their neighbors so much that they found ways to remain after death. Other places where the bonds of community proved stronger than the finality of biological existence. But I've never investigated those possibilities. Some questions are better left unasked, and some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. My job has been to protect and serve the people of Millbrook County, all of them, living and otherwise. The house that never sleeps continues to welcome its impossible residents, and the dead continue to live among us, sustained by love, memory, and the unbreakable bonds of community that transcend even death itself. In Millbrook County, some stories don't have endings. They just continue, night after night, in a place where time has learned to accommodate eternity. And every time I drive past 1247 Oakwood Drive and see those familiar lights in the windows, I'm reminded that the greatest mysteries aren't always the ones we solve. Sometimes they're the ones we choose to protect, the ones we learn to live with, and the ones that teach us that reality is far more flexible and wonderful than we ever dared to imagine. The Morrison case taught me that death isn't always the end of the story. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a different chapter, one written in the spaces between what we can prove and what we choose to believe. And in Millbrook County, we've chosen to believe in the power of community to transcend every boundary, even the one between life and death. That's the truth about what happened at 1247 Oakwood Drive and dozens of other addresses throughout my jurisdiction. It's not a ghost story or a supernatural mystery. It's a love story about people who cared so much about their community that death couldn't make them leave. And as long as there are people willing to remember them, to believe in them, and to protect their secret, they'll continue to be part of the living fabric of Millbrook County. The house that never sleeps stands as a testament to the power of human connection. A reminder that some bonds are stronger than death, and proof that home isn't just a place. It's a relationship that can endure forever. The name's Sheriff Jeremiah Stone, and I've been keeping the peace in Whispering Pines County, Montana for the better part of 22 years. Started as a deputy, fresh from the academy back in '98, worked my way up through detective sergeant, and took the sheriff's badge when my predecessor, Walt Garrison, retired to his fishing cabin up on Bitter Creek. Whispering Pines County sprawls across 3,200 square miles of big sky country, all mountain valleys, dense forests, and scattered ranches where families have worked the same land for 4 generations. We've got about 6,800 people spread across all that territory, most living in small towns with names like Silverbrook, Cedar Ridge, and Pine Haven. The county seat is Whispering Pines itself, population 2,400 on a good day, where Main Street still has wooden sidewalks, and the biggest excitement is usually the annual rodeo come August. I've seen plenty in my time. Cattle rustlers trying to make quick money off stolen livestock, domestic disputes that turned deadly when alcohol and firearms mixed badly, the occasional drug runner using our remote highways to transport methamphetamines from the Canadian border down to Denver. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what started happening in the winter of 2019 when the phone calls began. The first call came in on December 3rd, 2019, at exactly 11:47 p.m. I remember the precise time because I was finishing up paperwork at the office, planning to head home to my wife Margaret, and maybe catch the late news before bed. My dispatcher, Dolores Finch, had gone home at 11, so the night calls were being forwarded directly to my desk line. The phone rang with that sharp, metallic sound that old courthouse phones make, echoing through the empty hallways of the county building. When I picked up, I heard the voice of an elderly woman, clear and precise, despite what sounded like a poor connection. "Sheriff Stone? This is Patience Whitmore calling from 1847 Mountain View Road. I need to report suspicious activity on my property." I pulled out a notepad, figuring this was a routine call about prowlers, or maybe kids trespassing. Mountain View Road was a rural route about 15 miles north of town, home to several ranch properties and some summer cabins that were usually empty during winter months. I'd been down that road countless times over the years, knew most of the families who lived out there. The Whitmore name was familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. "What kind of suspicious activity, Mrs. Whitmore?" "There's a man in my barn, Sheriff. He's been there for 3 nights now. I can see his flashlight moving around, and I hear him talking to someone, though I can't make out the words. I live alone since my husband Ezekiel passed, and I'm afraid he might be dangerous." I asked for more details while reaching for my coat. The woman sounded genuinely frightened, and I took all calls from elderly residents seriously, especially those living in isolated areas. During Montana winters, help could be hours away if something went wrong, and folks who'd lived their whole lives in ranch country didn't spook easily. If Patience Whitmore was calling the sheriff about prowlers, she had good reason to be concerned. "Can you describe the man, Mrs. Whitmore?" "I haven't gotten a clear look at him, Sheriff. He keeps to the shadows, and the barn is a good 100 yards from the house. But he's been out there every night around this time, and I'm worried he might try to break into the house. Sometimes I hear more than one voice, like he's got someone with him." I told Mrs. Whitmore to lock her doors and stay inside while I drove out to investigate. The trip to Mountain View Road would take about 30 minutes in good weather, longer if the snow was coming down hard, which it had been doing for most of the week. December in northwestern Montana can be brutal, with temperatures dropping well below zero and snow that piles up so deep it can trap vehicles for days. As I drove through the dark countryside, snow swirling in my headlights, I tried to recall what I knew about Patience Whitmore. The name was familiar, but I couldn't place her immediately. Mountain View Road had several longtime residents, ranch families who had been in the area for decades, some going back to the original homestead days. The road itself was a winding two-lane that followed an old cattle trail through some of the most beautiful country in Montana. During daylight hours, you could see for miles across rolling hills and meadows, with the peaks of the northern Rockies rising in the distance. At night, especially during a snowstorm, it was a different story entirely. The darkness was complete except for my headlights, and the snow created a disorienting white tunnel that made it difficult to judge distances or recognize landmarks. When I reached 1847 Mountain View Road, I found the mailbox but no house. The mailbox stood at the end of a snow-covered driveway that led into the darkness, but my headlights revealed nothing beyond about 50 yards. I drove slowly up the lane, expecting to see a farmhouse and outbuildings, but the driveway simply ended at an open field covered in undisturbed snow. I got out of my patrol car and used my flashlight to search the area thoroughly. No house, no barn, no structures of any kind. According to my GPS, I was at the correct address, but there was nothing there except empty pasture land stretching away into the darkness. The only signs of human presence were the mailbox and the driveway, both of which appeared to be maintained, but led to nothing. I called dispatch on my radio, forgetting that Dolores had gone home and the night calls weren't being monitored. I tried calling the phone number Mrs. Whitmore had called from, but it went straight to a disconnected number message. Figuring I had somehow missed the correct location in the snow and darkness, I spent another hour driving up and down Mountain View Road, checking every driveway and mailbox. I found 1845 Mountain View Road, which belonged to the Harrison family, and 1849 Mountain View Road, which was the entrance to the old Copper Creek Ranch. But there was no 1847, and no evidence that such a property had ever existed. The Harrison place showed lights in the windows and smoke coming from the chimney, normal signs of winter occupation. The Copper Creek Ranch had its main buildings dark but secure, which was typical for a working ranch during the off-season. Between these two properties, where 1847 should have been, there was only the mysterious mailbox and driveway leading to empty land. I drove back to town, planning to follow up in the morning when I could see better and maybe check property records to figure out what had gone wrong. I assumed Mrs. Whitmore had given me an incorrect address, or perhaps she lived on a different road with a similar name. Montana had plenty of rural routes with confusing numbering systems, and elderly residents sometimes got confused about their exact addresses, especially when calling for help in stressful situations. The next morning, I asked Dolores to help me research the call. We checked property records, phone directories, tax rolls, and voter registration lists. There was no Patience Whitmore listed anywhere in Whispering Pines County. No property at 1847 Mountain View Road. No record of anyone by that name ever living in our jurisdiction. Maybe she was calling from outside the county, Dolores suggested. Could be someone from over in Glacier County got confused about which sheriff's department to call. I contacted the sheriffs in neighboring counties, but none of them had any record of a Patience Whitmore either. The phone number she had called from was registered to a company that had gone out of business in 1987. The utility companies had no records of service to 1847 Mountain View Road. The Postal Service confirmed that mail was not delivered to any such address. I filed the incident as a prank call and moved on to other matters, never imagining that it was just the beginning of something that would challenge my understanding of reality itself. 3 nights later, the phone rang again at exactly 11:47 p.m. Same voice, same clear connection despite the apparent age of the woman calling. "Sheriff Stone? This is Patience Whitmore again. That man is back in my barn, and this time he's brought someone with him. I can hear 2 voices now, and they seem to be moving equipment around. I'm truly frightened, Sheriff." This time, I was ready. I had already plotted the quickest route to Mountain View Road, and I left the office immediately while keeping Mrs. Whitmore on the line. "I'm driving out to your location now, Mrs. Whitmore. Can you stay on the phone with me?" "Of course, Sheriff. I'm watching from my bedroom window. I can see their lights moving around in the barn." As I drove, I kept Mrs. Whitmore talking, trying to gather more information about her situation. She described her property in detail: a 2-story farmhouse built in 1923, a red barn with a tin roof, a chicken coop, and several outbuildings. She mentioned landmarks that I recognized, including Copper Creek, which ran along the back of her property, and an old stone bridge that had been built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. All of these landmarks existed. I knew the area she was describing perfectly. Copper Creek ran through that section of Mountain View Road, and the stone bridge was a local historical landmark that appeared on tourist maps. But when I arrived at 1847 Mountain View Road, I found the same empty field I had discovered 3 nights earlier. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm at your address, but I don't see any structures. Are you sure you have the correct road name?" "I'm looking right at you, Sheriff. You're parked at the end of my driveway with your headlights pointing toward my house. I can see your patrol car clearly." I got out of my car and used my flashlight to sweep the area in all directions. Nothing but snow-covered pasture and fence posts marking property boundaries. The woman on the phone insisted she could see me, could see my flashlight beam, could see my patrol car parked in front of her house. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to turn on your porch light so I can locate your house." "The porch light is already on, Sheriff." "It's been on since I called you. You're standing right in front of it." I was standing in the middle of an empty field. There was no porch light, no house, no barn. But the woman on the phone continued to provide a running commentary of my movements that was completely accurate. "Now, you're walking toward the barn. Be careful, Sheriff. The ground is uneven there where Ezekiel dug out that stump last spring." I was indeed walking toward where she said the barn should be, and the ground was uneven in exactly the spot she mentioned. My boots found depression in the earth that could have been where a large stump had been removed. But there was no barn, no stump, no evidence of any digging. "Sheriff, the men in the barn have gone quiet. I think they heard you coming." I drew my service weapon and approached the area where Mrs. Whitmore claimed her barn was located. I could hear nothing except the wind through the trees and the distant sound of Copper Creek flowing over the stone bridge. The night was crystal clear, with stars visible despite the snow clouds on the horizon, and I had excellent visibility across the empty landscape. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not seeing anything here. No barn, no men, no suspicious activity." There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note of confusion I hadn't heard before. "Sheriff, I don't understand. They were just here, both of them. And you're standing right in front of my barn. I can see you clear as day." Oh, the phone connection started to break up with static, and Mrs. Whitmore's voice became faint and distant. "Sheriff? Sheriff, are you still there? Something's wrong. I can't see you anymore. Everything's going dark." The line went dead. I spent 2 hours searching the area with my flashlight, looking for any evidence of structures, recent activity, or signs that someone had been in the vicinity. I found nothing except undisturbed snow and the natural features of the landscape that Mrs. Whitmore had described so accurately. The next morning, I began a more thorough investigation. I drove to the courthouse and pulled every property record, survey map, and historical document related to Mountain View Road. What I discovered was disturbing. There had been a property at 1847 Mountain View Road. The original homestead was filed in 1888 by a settler named Ezekiel Whitmore and his wife Patience. They had built a farmhouse, barn, and various outbuildings on 160 acres of land that included frontage on Copper Creek. The Whitmores had lived on that property for over 30 years, raising cattle and horses, growing crops, and becoming respected members of the Mountain View Road community. They were known for their hospitality and their willingness to help neighbors during difficult times. Ezekiel had served as a volunteer firefighter and helped organize the construction of the stone bridge that still crossed Copper Creek. Patience had been active in the local women's auxiliary and had taught Sunday school at the Methodist church in town. But according to the county records, the Whitmore property had been destroyed in a fire on March 15, 1923. The house, barn, and all outbuildings had burned to the ground during a late winter storm. Ezekiel and Patience Whitmore had both perished in the fire, along with their hired hand, a man named Theodore Marsh. The fire had been investigated by the county sheriff at the time, but the cause was never definitively determined. The report mentioned that neighbors had seen unusual lights around the property in the weeks before the fire, and some had reported hearing voices and sounds of activity at odd hours. But these observations were dismissed as irrelevant to the investigation. The property had been sold for taxes 3 years later and eventually incorporated into the Copper Creek Ranch. There had been no structures on that land for nearly a century. Yet, I had been receiving phone calls from Patience Whitmore, who was describing the property exactly as it had existed before the fire, including details about the stone bridge and Copper Creek that were accurate to current conditions. I drove back to Mountain View Road with the historical surveys in hand and studied the area where the Whitmore homestead had once stood. With the old property maps as reference, I could identify the exact locations where the house and barn had been built. The foundation stones were still there, buried under decades of accumulated soil and vegetation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. I used a metal detector to locate the old property boundaries and found remnants of fence posts, rusted farm equipment, and other artifacts that confirmed this had once been an active homestead. But there had been no structures on this land since 1923. That evening, I waited at the office for Mrs. Whitmore's call. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the phone rang. "Sheriff Stone? This is Patience Whitmore. I need to report that those men are back, and this time they've brought more people with them. There are at least 4 of them now, and they have some kind of machinery running in my barn. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to ask you some questions. What year do you think it is?" There was a pause before she answered. "Why, it's 1923, Sheriff. December 6th, 1923. Mrs. Whitmore, can you tell me about the fire?" The silence that followed was so long I thought the connection had been lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "What fire, Sheriff?" "There hasn't been any fire. My house is fine, my barn is fine. Everything is just as it should be. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm looking at county records that show your property burned down in March of 1923. You and your husband died in that fire. Sheriff, I don't know what records you're looking at, but there's been a mistake. Ezekiel and I are both fine. We're here in our house and those men are still in our barn. Can you please come out and help us?" I realized I was talking to someone who was either completely delusional or operating from a reality that existed 96 years in the past. But her descriptions of current conditions at the property were too accurate to dismiss as hallucinations. Mrs. Whitmore, I'll come out to your property, but I need you to help me understand something. When you look out your window, what do you see? I see my farmyard, Sheriff. The house, the barn, the chicken coop, the pasture where our cattle are grazing. I see Copper Creek running behind the property and the stone bridge that the government men built last year. I see your patrol car parked at the end of our driveway. What kind of car am I driving, Mrs. Whitmore? It's a black automobile, Sheriff. One of those new police cars with the electric lights on top. My patrol car was a white Ford Explorer with modern emergency lighting. But in 1923, police vehicles would have been black, and electric emergency lights would have been a new innovation. I drove to Mountain View Road again, this time bringing a digital camera and additional equipment. When I arrived at the location where the Whitmore property had once stood, I could see nothing but the same empty field. But I set up my camera on a tripod and began taking photographs while Mrs. Whitmore provided commentary from the phone. I can see you setting up some kind of equipment, Sheriff. What is that contraption? It's a camera, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm taking pictures of your property. Well, that's quite a fancy camera, Sheriff. Much more modern than anything we have around here. I took dozens of photographs from different angles, including shots of the areas where Mrs. Whitmore claimed her house and barn were located. When I reviewed the images later, they showed only empty fields and natural landscape features. But when I enhanced the images using computer software, I found something that made my blood run cold. In several of the photographs, there were faint shadows and geometric patterns that corresponded to the locations where structures should have been. Not actual buildings, but impressions or imprints that suggested something had once stood there. More disturbing was a thermal imaging scan I conducted using equipment borrowed from the state police. The scan showed heat signatures in the exact shapes and locations of the buildings Mrs. Whitmore described, even though nothing visible existed in those locations. The phone calls continued every few nights throughout December and into January. Always at 11:47 p.m., always from Patience Whitmore reporting suspicious activity on her property. Each call provided more details about the men she claimed were operating in her barn, and each call revealed more information about her life in 1923. She described Ezekiel's work with the cattle, their plans for expanding the farm, their concerns about winter weather affecting their livestock. She mentioned neighbors by name, many of whom I researched and found had indeed lived in the area during the 1920s. The Harrison family had been there, as had the owners of what was now Copper Creek Ranch. Even the Methodist minister she mentioned had been documented in church records from that period. But she also began describing the suspicious men in more detail, and what she told me was deeply unsettling. Sheriff, I've been watching these men more carefully, and I don't think they're from around here. They dress strangely and they have equipment I've never seen before. Theodore thinks they might be claim jumpers trying to steal our land. Theodore Marsh was the hired hand who had died in the fire along with the Whitmores. Yet, Mrs. Whitmore spoke about him as if he were alive and present. What kind of equipment are they using, Mrs. Whitmore? They have machines that make noise, but don't seem to accomplish anything useful. And they have lights that are much brighter than any kerosene lanterns I've ever seen. Theodore says they might be federal agents investigating something. During one call in late January, Mrs. Whitmore provided information that changed my entire understanding of what was happening. Sheriff, Theodore got closer to the men tonight and he overheard them talking. They're not from our time, Sheriff. They're from the future, and they're here to change something about the fire. What fire, Mrs. Whitmore? The one that's going to happen in March. They know about it, Sheriff. They know our house is going to burn down, and they're trying to prevent it or change how it happens. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana winter. Mrs. Whitmore was describing events that had already happened 96 years earlier, but from her perspective they were still 3 months in the future. Mrs. Whitmore, who are these men? What do they look like? They're dressed in clothing I don't recognize, Sheriff. Modern clothing, much more modern than anything we wear here, and they have devices that glow and make beeping sounds. Theodore thinks they might be from the year 2000 or even later. That's when I realized what I was dealing with. The suspicious men that Patience Whitmore was reporting were investigators from our time, people who had been studying the Whitmore fire and its aftermath. They were appearing in her reality as intruders because they were using modern equipment to investigate events that, from her perspective, hadn't happened yet. I began researching who might be conducting historical or paranormal investigations at the former Whitmore property. What I found was disturbing. 3 different groups had been granted permits to conduct research at the site over the past 5 years. A team of historians from the University of Montana studying homestead fires in the early 1900s. A group of paranormal investigators documenting supposedly haunted locations in northwestern Montana. And most recently, a group of archaeologists examining the foundations of the original Whitmore buildings. All 3 groups had reported unusual experiences at the site. Equipment malfunctions, unexplained sounds, feelings of being watched, and in some cases, brief glimpses of structures that shouldn't have been there. The archaeologists had been the most recent visitors, conducting their survey work in late November and early December, exactly when Mrs. Whitmore's phone calls had begun. I contacted Dr. Miranda Hawthorne, the lead archaeologist on the project, and asked about her team's experiences at the Whitmore site. "Sheriff Stone, I'm glad you called," Dr. Hawthorne said. "We had some very unusual experiences out there. My team swore they could see lights in buildings that didn't exist, and our equipment registered electromagnetic anomalies that we couldn't explain. We also found evidence of recent disturbances in areas where no one should have been." "What kind of disturbances?" "Footprints in the snow around the foundation sites, areas where the ground had been disturbed as if someone had been digging recently. But the interesting thing is that the footprints appeared to be from period-appropriate footwear, leather boots with hand-forged nails, the kind of thing people wore in the 1920s. Dr. Hawthorne's team had also documented thermal anomalies consistent with what I had recorded during my own visits to the site. They had found evidence of structures that weren't visible but registered on various scientific instruments. The most unusual thing, Dr. Hawthorne continued, was that our presence seemed to be affecting whatever was happening at the site. Our equipment would pick up sounds of activity, voices, machinery, animals, but only when we weren't directly observing the area. I realized that the archaeological investigation was creating a feedback loop with whatever was happening at the Whitmore property. The modern investigators were appearing in Patience Whitmore's 1923 reality as the suspicious men she was reporting, while her attempts to get law enforcement help were reaching forward in time to my office in 2019. The situation escalated in February when Mrs. Whitmore called with genuine panic in her voice. "Sheriff Stone, something terrible is happening. Those men have convinced Theodore to help them. He says they've shown him what's going to happen to us in March, and they want to prevent the fire. But Sheriff, I think they're going to cause it instead." "What do you mean, Mrs. Whitmore?" "They've been digging around the foundation of our house, and they've installed some kind of devices in our barn. Theodore says they're trying to create a fire break to save the buildings, but I think they're actually setting up the conditions that will cause the fire." Mrs. Whitmore's observation was more perceptive than she realized. Historical records showed that the Whitmore fire had started under mysterious circumstances. The official investigation had concluded that faulty electrical wiring was the cause, But this was suspicious since the Whitmores didn't have electricity on their property in 1923. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to be very careful. Don't let Theodore or anyone else make changes to your property. The fire that's going to happen in March has already happened from my perspective. If these men try to prevent it, they might create a paradox that could be dangerous for everyone involved. I don't understand what you mean, Sheriff. How can something that's going to happen have already happened? That was when I had to make a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my career. I could continue to treat Mrs. Whitmore's calls as a curiosity, an unexplained phenomenon that didn't directly affect my jurisdiction. Or I could accept that I was somehow in contact with people who had died 96 years earlier and try to help them. Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You're living in 1923, and I'm living in 2019. The fire that you're worried about happening in March has already occurred. You and Ezekiel died in that fire, along with Theodore. But somehow, you're able to contact me across time when you're in danger. There was a long silence before she responded. Sheriff, that doesn't make any sense. I'm sitting in my house right now, talking to you on the telephone. Ezekiel is sleeping upstairs and Theodore is in the bunkhouse. We're all alive and fine. I know it doesn't make sense, Mrs. Whitmore, but I think the men you've been seeing are investigators from my time who are trying to study what happened to you. Their presence in your time might be what causes the fire that kills you. What should we do, Sheriff? That question would keep me awake for months afterward. How do you advise someone to prevent their own death when that death has already occurred nearly a century earlier? How do you explain the concept of time paradoxes to someone who's living them? Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to gather Ezekiel and Theodore and leave your property. Go stay with neighbors until after March 15th. Don't let anyone make any changes to your house or barn, and don't let the strange men install any equipment on your land. But Sheriff, this is our home. We can't just abandon our livestock and our property. Mrs. Whitmore, your lives are more important than your property. Please trust me on this. The next few weeks were some of the strangest of my law enforcement career. I continued to receive calls from Patience Whitmore, reporting on the increasing activity around her property. The men from our time were becoming more aggressive in their attempts to prevent the historical fire, apparently unaware that their interference might be the cause of the very tragedy they were trying to prevent. Mrs. Whitmore described a complex series of modifications being made to her property by the time travelers. They had installed what she called lightning rods around her house, dug trenches to redirect water flow, and placed mysterious devices in her barn that hummed with electrical energy. All of these improvements were consistent with what modern fire prevention specialists might install, but they would have been completely foreign technology in 1923. More importantly, they involved electrical systems that could potentially malfunction and cause the very fire they were meant to prevent. On March 10th, 5 days before the historical date of the fire, Mrs. Whitmore called in a state of near hysteria. Sheriff Stone, you have to help us. The men have convinced Theodore that they need to test their fire prevention system tonight. They want to set a small fire to make sure their equipment works properly. But Sheriff, I have a terrible feeling about this. Mrs. Whitmore, under no circumstances should you allow them to set any kind of fire on your property. You need to leave immediately. We've already packed our belongings and moved the cattle to the upper pasture, just like you advised. But Theodore says we need to be here to help with the test. He trusts these men completely. Mrs. Whitmore, Theodore died in the fire along with you and Ezekiel. He's not making good decisions because he doesn't understand what's really happening. Sheriff, I'm frightened. There are more of them now, and they have machinery that I've never seen before. They keep talking about temporal stabilization and preventing the paradox, but I don't understand what they mean. Neither did I, but it sounded like the investigators from our time had realized they were dealing with some kind of time anomaly and were trying to manage it scientifically. The problem was that their scientific approach might be creating the very disaster they were trying to prevent. Mrs. Whitmore, I want you to get Ezekiel and leave your property immediately. Don't wait for Theodore. Don't help with any tests. Just go to your neighbors and stay there until I tell you it's safe to return. All right, Sheriff, I trust you. We'll leave right now. That was the last normal conversation I had with Patience Whitmore. The phone calls continued, but they became increasingly frantic and difficult to understand. She reported explosions, fires, and chaos on her property as the investigators from our time apparently attempted to test their fire prevention systems. On March 15, 2020, exactly 97 years after the original fire, I received a final call from Mrs. Whitmore at 11:47 p.m. Sheriff Stone, they've done it. The fire has started, and it's spreading faster than anyone expected. The men from the future couldn't stop it. Their equipment made it worse. Ezekiel and I are trapped in the house. Theodore is trying to reach us, but the flames are too intense. Mrs. Whitmore, can you get out of the house? Can you reach safety? No, Sheriff, the whole building is engulfed. The men from the future are running away. Their machines are exploding, making the fire spread even faster. Sheriff, I think we're going to die. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. I tried to warn you. I know you did, Sheriff. You're a good man, and you tried to help us. But I think this was always going to happen, no matter what anyone tried to do to prevent it. The phone line filled with static, and through the interference, I could hear sounds of destruction, crackling flames, collapsing timbers, voices shouting in panic. Sheriff Stone, Mrs. Whitmore's voice came through the static, faint but clear. Thank you for trying to save us. And Sheriff, be careful. I think the men who caused our fire are still in your time. They might try to change other things. The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the number was permanently disconnected. Mrs. Whitmore never called again. The next morning, I drove to the former Whitmore property on Mountain View Road. The field looked exactly as it always had. Empty, snow-covered, with no visible signs of any structures. But as I walked around the area where the house and barn had once stood, I found fresh burn marks in the snow and the smell of smoke in the air. Using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar, I discovered new artifacts buried in the exact locations where the buildings would have been. Pieces of modern electronic equipment, melted plastic components, and fragments of materials that hadn't existed in 1923. The investigators from our time had somehow traveled back to 1923, attempted to prevent the Whitmore fire, and ended up causing it. Their modern fire prevention equipment had malfunctioned in the past, creating the electrical problems that historical records blamed for the original fire. I tried to track down the research teams that had been working at the Whitmore site, but found that all three groups had disbanded shortly after their investigations. Dr. Hawthorne and her archaeological team had relocated to different universities and refused to discuss their work in Montana. The paranormal investigators had closed their organization and deleted their website. The historical research team from the University of Montana claimed to have no records of any project related to the Whitmore fire. It was as if everyone who had been involved in studying the site had been instructed to forget about their work and disappear. But I kept investigating, because Mrs. Whitmore's final warning haunted me. If these time travelers were still active, they might attempt to change other historical events, possibly creating more paradoxes and more tragedies. Over the following months, I documented similar anomalies at other historical sites throughout Montana. Properties where tragedies had occurred in the past were experiencing unexplained modern activity. Researchers were investigating these sites and then disappearing from public records. And in some cases, locals reported phone calls from people who claimed to be living in the past, but described conditions that matched current circumstances. I compiled a detailed report on what I had discovered and submitted it to state and federal authorities. The response was swift and troubling. I was informed that my investigation involved classified materials, and that I was to cease all research related to temporal anomalies. My files were confiscated, and I was instructed never to discuss the Whitmore case with anyone. But they couldn't confiscate my memories or my sense of responsibility to the people of Whispering Pines County, living or dead. I continued to monitor the situation quietly, responding to similar calls when they came in, and documenting incidents that suggested time travelers were still operating in our area. 3 months after the final call from Patience Whitmore, I received a call at exactly 11:47 p.m. from someone claiming to be Cornelius Blackwood, reporting suspicious activity at his property on Cedar Ridge Road. When I investigated, I found that Cornelius Blackwood had died in a mining accident in 1952, and his property had been abandoned for 70 years. The pattern was identical to the Whitmore case. Modern investigators studying the historical accident were appearing in the past reality of the victim, who was trying to contact law enforcement for help. I realized that what had happened to Patience Whitmore was part of a larger phenomenon affecting multiple historical sites throughout our region. 6 months later, I received a call from someone claiming to be Isabella Fairchild, reporting strange lights and machinery around her homestead on Timber Creek. Isabella Fairchild had died in a house fire in 1934. Again, the pattern was identical. Modern researchers investigating the historical tragedy were inadvertently appearing in the past reality of the victim. Each case followed the same progression. Initial calls reporting suspicious activity, descriptions of modern equipment, and investigators appearing as strange men in the historical time period, escalating fear as the historical tragedy approached, and finally, a desperate plea for help as the paradox created by time travel caused the very disaster the investigators were trying to prevent. I began to understand that what was happening in Whispering Pines County was not an isolated incident. Somewhere, somehow, people from our time had developed the ability to travel back in time, and they were systematically attempting to prevent historical tragedies. But their interference was creating temporal paradoxes that actually caused the disasters they were trying to prevent. The technology or method they were using seemed to be unstable, creating situations where people in the past could communicate across time to our present, calling for help from law enforcement officers who might be able to intervene. But by the time I understood what was happening, it was always too late to prevent the tragedy. Over the years that followed, I received dozens of similar calls, always at 11:47 p.m., always from people who had died in historical tragedies, always reporting the presence of strange men with modern equipment who were supposedly trying to help but actually causing the disasters they were attempting to prevent. I learned to recognize the pattern and began maintaining detailed files on each case, even though I was officially forbidden from investigating temporal anomalies. I documented the names, dates, locations, and circumstances of each incident, hoping that someday I might be able to use this information to prevent the time travelers from causing more paradoxes. The cases spanned over a century of historical tragedies throughout Montana and neighboring states. Mine disasters, house fires, floods, avalanches, all events that had been studied by modern researchers who somehow found ways to travel back in time to witness or prevent the tragedies. But in every case, their presence in the past created the conditions that caused the very disasters they were trying to stop. I began to suspect that the time travelers were not intentionally causing these paradoxes. They seemed to be researchers or investigators who had discovered some method of temporal travel and were using it to study historical events. But their presence in the past was creating unintended consequences that resulted in the tragedies they were investigating. The fact that victims in the past could contact me in the present suggested that the time travel was creating rifts or distortions in the normal flow of time. These distortions allowed communication across temporal boundaries, but also created instabilities that manifested as the historical disasters. As my understanding of the phenomenon deepened, I began to realize that the midnight callers were not just victims of temporal paradoxes, they were warnings. Each call was an attempt by someone in the past to alert modern authorities about the presence of time travelers who were inadvertently causing historical disasters. The calls always came at 11:47 p.m., always involved reports of suspicious men with modern equipment, and always escalated into pleas for help as the historical tragedy approached. The timing seemed significant. Perhaps 11:47 p.m. was some kind of optimal window for temporal communication, or perhaps it was simply when the victims were most likely to be awake and observant of unusual activity on their properties. I began staying late at the office every night waiting for the phone to ring at 11:47 p.m. When calls came in, I would listen carefully to the caller's description of events and try to provide guidance that might help them avoid the impending disaster. But in every case, the outcome was the same. The time traveler's attempts to prevent the tragedy would ultimately cause it. The most disturbing aspect of these cases was the realization that modern researchers were systematically studying historical disasters and then traveling back in time to observe or prevent them. This suggested an organized effort involving significant resources and advanced technology. But whoever was behind the time travel program seemed unaware that their activities were creating the very disasters they were studying. I attempted to investigate the source of the time travel activities, but found that the researchers involved would disappear from public records shortly after their historical investigations. University programs would be disbanded, research organizations would close, and individual researchers would relocate or change careers. It was as if someone was systematically covering up evidence of the time travel program. The cover-up extended to government agencies as well. My attempts to report the temporal anomalies to federal authorities resulted in threats and intimidation rather than investigation. I was told that my reports involved classified programs, and that any further investigation on my part would result in serious consequences. But the midnight calls continued, and with each call, I learned more about the scope and nature of the time travel activities. The calls came from victims of disasters spanning over a century, suggesting that the time travelers had developed the ability to visit any point in history. The consistency of the reports indicated that the same group or organization was behind all the time travel activities. Most disturbing was the realization that the time travelers seemed to be focusing on preventable disasters, tragedies that might have been avoided if circumstances had been slightly different. House fires that could have been prevented with better fire safety equipment, mining accidents that could have been avoided with improved safety procedures, natural disasters that could have been survived with early warning systems. The time travelers appeared to be attempting to install modern safety equipment or warning systems in the past, but their anachronistic technology was creating the very conditions that caused the disasters. Electrical equipment that was too advanced for the time period would malfunction and cause fires. Modern mining equipment would destabilize underground structures and cause cave-ins. Early warning systems would create panic that led to stampedes or other disasters. Each attempt to prevent a historical tragedy resulted in a temporal paradox that not only failed to prevent the disaster, but actually caused it. The time travelers were trapped in a cycle of good intentions that inevitably led to terrible consequences. As the years passed, I began to realize that my role as the recipient of these midnight calls was not coincidental. Somehow, my position as sheriff of Whispering Pines County had made me a focal point for temporal communication. Perhaps it was my geographical location, or perhaps it was something about my personal characteristics that made me accessible to people calling across time. The responsibility was overwhelming. Each midnight call represented real people in the past who were about to die in disasters that were being caused by well-intentioned time travelers. I could provide guidance and support, but I couldn't prevent the tragedies from occurring. The temporal paradoxes seemed to be self-fulfilling. The very attempt to change history ensured that history would unfold exactly as it was recorded. I began to understand that the midnight callers were not just seeking help, they were bearing witness. Each call was a testimony about the final hours of people who had been killed by temporal paradoxes. They were creating a record of what really happened, even though their voices would only be heard by one person nearly a century in the future. The calls became a sacred trust. I was the only person in the present who knew the true cause of dozens of historical disasters. I was the keeper of secrets that could never be revealed, the guardian of knowledge that could never be used to prevent future tragedies, because any attempt to interfere would create new paradoxes. 20 years after receiving the first call from Patience Whitmore, I still sit in my office every night at 11:47 p.m. waiting for the phone to ring. The midnight callers continue to reach across time, reporting the activities of time travelers who don't understand that their presence in the past is causing the very disasters they're trying to prevent. Each call is a reminder that time is more fragile than we imagine, that the past is not fixed and immutable, and that good intentions can lead to terrible consequences when they interfere with the natural flow of history. The midnight callers are voices from a past that has been changed by visitors from the future, creating paradoxes that trap both the living and the dead in cycles of tragedy and loss. I can never reveal what I know about the temporal anomalies affecting our region. I can never prevent the time travelers from causing more disasters because I don't know who they are or how to stop them. All I can do is listen to the midnight callers and bear witness to their final hours, honoring their memories and preserving the truth about how they really died. Because the truth is that what happened to Patience Whitmore, Ezekiel, and Theodore is still happening. Somewhere in the spaces between past and present, people who died in historical disasters are trying to contact law enforcement officers who might be able to help them. They're calling across decades and centuries, reaching through time to report dangers that they can't understand or escape on their own. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in the sheriff's office, the phone rings at exactly 11:47 p.m. When I answer, I hear the voice of someone who died years or decades earlier, asking for help with problems that exist in a time I can never reach. I always listen. I always try to help. Because that's what law enforcement means in a place like Whispering Pines County, where time isn't always linear, where the past and present sometimes overlap, and where the dead sometimes need protection just as much as the living. The midnight caller taught me that some cases can never be closed, some mysteries span centuries, and some responsibilities extend beyond the boundaries of time itself. Patience. Whitmore died in 1923, but she trusted me to protect her in 2019. And even though I failed to save her, I won't fail the next person who calls across time asking for help. Because somewhere in the darkness between past and present, the phone is ringing, and someone who died long ago is hoping that this time, law enforcement will be able to prevent the tragedy that's been happening over and over again, trapped in an endless loop of time where good intentions create terrible consequences, and the only witnesses are the voices of the dead, calling out in the night, seeking help that can never come soon enough to save them from a fate that has already been written in history. The case files say Patience Whitmore died in 1923. But every night at 11:47 p.m., she's still calling for help, and I'm still the only one who can hear her voice echoing across the decades, carrying a warning about time travelers who don't understand that the past fights back when you try to change it, and that some tragedies are meant to happen exactly as they were recorded, no matter how many good people try to prevent them from across the centuries. The Midnight Caller. The name's Sheriff Jeremiah Stone, and I've been keeping the peace in Whispering Pines County, Montana for the better part of 22 years. Started as a deputy fresh from the academy back in '98, worked my way up through detective sergeant, and took the sheriff's badge when my predecessor, Walt Garrison, retired to his fishing cabin up on Bitter Creek. Whispering Pines County sprawls across 3,200 square miles of Big Sky country, all mountain valleys, dense forests, and scattered ranches where families have worked the same land for 4 generations. We've got about 6,800 people spread across all that territory, most living in small towns with names like Silverbrook, Cedar Ridge, and Pine Haven. The county seat is Whispering Pines itself, population 2,400 on a good day, where Main Street still has wooden sidewalks, and the biggest excitement is usually the annual rodeo come August. I've seen plenty in my time. Cattle rustlers trying to make quick money off stolen livestock, domestic disputes that turned deadly when alcohol and firearms mixed badly, the occasional drug runner using our remote highways to transport methamphetamines from the Canadian border down to Denver. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what started happening in the winter of 2019 when the phone calls began. The first call came in on December 3rd, 2019, at exactly 11:47 p.m. I remember the precise time because I was finishing up paperwork at the office, planning to head home to my wife Margaret, and maybe catch the late news before bed. My dispatcher, Dolores Finch, had gone home at 11, so the night calls were being forwarded directly to my desk line. The phone rang with that sharp metallic sound that old courthouse phones make, echoing through the empty hallways of the county building. When I picked up, I heard the voice of an elderly woman, clear and precise, despite what sounded like a poor connection. "Sheriff Stone? This is Patience Whitmore calling from 1847 Mountain View Road. I need to report suspicious activity on my property." I pulled out a notepad, figuring this was a routine call about prowlers or maybe kids trespassing. Mountain View Road was a rural route about 15 miles north of town, home to several ranch properties and some summer cabins that were usually empty during winter months. What kind of suspicious activity, Mrs. Whitmore? "There's a man in my barn, Sheriff. He's been there for 3 nights now. I can see his flashlight moving around, and I hear him talking to someone, though I can't make out the words. I live alone since my husband Ezekiel passed, and I'm afraid he might be dangerous." I asked for more details while reaching for my coat. The woman sounded genuinely frightened, and I took all calls from elderly residents seriously, especially those living in isolated areas. During Montana winters, help could be hours away if something went wrong. "Can you describe the man, Mrs. Whitmore?" "I haven't gotten a clear look at him, Sheriff. He keeps to the shadows, and the barn is a good 100 yards from the house. But he's been out there every night around this time, and I'm worried he might try to break into the house." I told Mrs. Whitmore to lock her doors and stay inside while I drove out to investigate. The trip to Mountain View Road would take about 30 minutes in good weather, longer if the snow was coming down hard, which it had been doing for most of the week. As I drove through the dark countryside, snow swirling in my headlights, I tried to recall what I knew about Patience Whitmore. The name was familiar, but I couldn't place her immediately. Mountain View Road had several long-time residents, ranch families who had been in the area for decades. When I reached 1847 Mountain View Road, I found the mailbox but no house. The mailbox stood at the end of a snow-covered driveway that led into the darkness, but my headlights revealed nothing beyond about 50 yards. I drove slowly up the lane, expecting to see a farmhouse and outbuildings, but the driveway simply ended at an open field covered in undisturbed snow. I got out of my patrol car and used my flashlight to search the area thoroughly. No house, no barn, no structures of any kind. According to my GPS, I was at the correct address, but there was nothing there except empty pasture land. I called dispatch on my radio, forgetting that Dolores had gone home and the night calls weren't being monitored. I tried calling the phone number Mrs. Whitmore had called from, but it went straight to a disconnected number message. Figuring I had somehow missed the correct location in the snow and darkness, I spent another hour driving up and down Mountain View Road, checking every driveway and mailbox. I found 1845 Mountain View Road, which belonged to the Harrison family, and 1849 Mountain View Road, which was the entrance to the old Copper Creek Ranch. But there was no 1847, and no evidence that such a property had ever existed. I drove back to town, planning to follow up in the morning when I could see better, and maybe check property records to figure out what had gone wrong. I assumed Mrs. Whitmore had given me an incorrect address, or perhaps she lived on a different road with a similar name. The next morning, I asked Dolores to help me research the call. We checked property records, phone directories, tax rolls, and voter registration lists. There was no Patience Whitmore listed anywhere in Whispering Pines County. No property at 1847 Mountain View Road. No record of anyone by that name ever living in our jurisdiction. Maybe she was calling from outside the county, Dolores suggested. Could be someone from over in Glacier County got confused about which sheriff's department to call. I contacted the sheriffs in neighboring counties, but none of them had any record of a Patience Whitmore either. The phone number she had called from was registered to a company that had gone out of business in 1987. I filed the incident as a prank call and moved on to other matters, never imagining that it was just the beginning of something that would challenge my understanding of reality itself. 3 nights later, the phone rang again at exactly 11:47 p.m. Same voice, same clear connection despite the apparent age of the woman calling. "Sheriff Stone? This is Patience Whitmore again. That man is back in my barn, and this time he's brought someone with him. I can hear 2 voices now, and they seem to be moving equipment around. I'm truly frightened, Sheriff." This time I was ready. I had already plotted the quickest route to Mountain View Road, and I left the office immediately while keeping Mrs. Whitmore on the line. "I'm driving out to your location now, Mrs. Whitmore. Can you stay on the phone with me?" "Of course, Sheriff. I'm watching from my bedroom window. I can see their lights moving around in the barn." As I drove, I kept Mrs. Whitmore talking, trying to gather more information about her situation. She described her property in detail. A 2-story farmhouse built in 1923, a red barn with a tin roof, a chicken coop, and several outbuildings. She mentioned landmarks that I recognized, including Copper Creek, which ran along the back of her property, and an old stone bridge that had been built by the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 1930s. All of these landmarks existed. I knew the area she was describing, but when I arrived at 1847 Mountain View Road, I found the same empty field I had discovered 3 nights earlier. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm at your address, but I don't see any structures. Are you sure you have the correct road name?" "I'm looking right at you, Sheriff. You're parked at the end of my driveway with your headlights pointing toward my house. I can see your patrol car clearly." I got out of my car and used my flashlight to sweep the area in all directions. Nothing but snow-covered pasture and fence posts. The woman on the phone insisted she could see me, could see my flashlight beam, could see my patrol car parked in front of her house. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to turn on your porch light so I can locate your house." "The porch light is already on, Sheriff." "It's been on since I called you. You're standing right in front of it." I was standing in the middle of an empty field. There was no porch light, no house, no barn. But the woman on the phone continued to provide a running commentary of my movements that was completely accurate. "Now you're walking toward the barn. Be careful, Sheriff. The ground is uneven there, where Ezekiel dug out that stump last spring." I was indeed walking toward where she said the barn should be, and the ground was uneven in exactly the spot she mentioned. But there was no barn, no stump, no evidence of any digging. "Sheriff, the men in the barn have gone quiet. I think they heard you coming." I drew my service weapon and approached the area where Mrs. Whitmore claimed her barn was located. I could hear nothing except the wind through the trees and the distant sound of Copper Creek flowing over the stone bridge. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not seeing anything here. No barn, no men, no suspicious activity." There was a long pause before she responded, and when she did, her voice carried a note of confusion I hadn't heard before. "Sheriff, I don't understand. They were just here, both of them. And you're standing right in front of my barn. I can see you clear as day." The phone connection started to break up with static, and Mrs. Whitmore's voice became faint and distant. "Sheriff? Sheriff, are you still there? Something's wrong. I can't see you anymore. Everything's going dark." The line went dead. I spent 2 hours searching the area with my flashlight, looking for any evidence of structures, recent activity, or signs that someone had been in the vicinity. I found nothing except undisturbed snow and the natural features of the landscape. The next morning, I began a more thorough investigation. I drove to the courthouse and pulled every property record, survey map, and historical document related to Mountain View Road. What I discovered was disturbing. There had been a property at 1847 Mountain View Road. The original homestead was filed in 1888 by a settler named Ezekiel Whitmore and his wife Patience. They had built a farmhouse, barn, and various outbuildings on 160 acres of land that included frontage on Copper Creek. The Whitmores had lived on that property for over 30 years, raising cattle and horses, growing crops, and becoming respected members of the Mountain View Road community. They were known for their hospitality and their willingness to help neighbors during difficult times. I go by Sheriff Bartholomew Crenshaw, but most folks in Ravens Hollow County just call me Bart. I've been keeping order in this corner of rural Kentucky for going on 17 years now, ever since I took over from Sheriff McCready when he passed from that heart attack back in 2006. Before that, I served 8 years as a deputy and 2 years as a detective, so I've seen pretty much every variety of trouble that can find its way into our remote mountain communities. Ravens Hollow County sits tucked into the eastern Kentucky mountains, where the hollers run deep and the ridgelines stretch for miles without seeing so much as a power line. We've got about 4,100 people spread across 800 square miles of some of the most rugged terrain you'll find anywhere in Appalachia. Most of our residents live in small communities with names like Widow's Creek, Copper Hollow, and Timber Ridge, places where families have lived for 6 or 7 generations, and the outside world might as well be on another planet. The people here are good folks, hardworking and honest, but they're also intensely private and suspicious of outsiders. They've got good reason to be cautious. Over the years, plenty of people have come into these mountains looking to exploit the land or the people, from coal companies that stripped the mountains bare to drug dealers who figured remote hollers would make good places to cook methamphetamine. As sheriff, I've learned that earning trust in Ravens Hollow County takes time, patience, and a genuine respect for the way people have chosen to live their lives. The case that changed everything for me started on a muggy July morning in 2021 when I received a call from Prudence Ashford, who lived alone in a big old house on Blackberry Hill Road, about 12 miles outside the county seat. Miss Prudence was 87 years old, sharp as a tack, and had never once called the sheriff's department in all my years of service. When someone like that reaches out for help, you pay attention. "Sheriff Crenshaw," she said when I answered the phone, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of worry that immediately put me on alert. "I need you to come out to my property. There's been someone in my house, going through my things, and I think they're still here." I grabbed my hat and keys, telling my dispatcher Marlene Hobbs that I was responding to a possible break-in at the Ashford place. The drive to Blackberry Hill Road took me through some of the prettiest country in Kentucky. Rolling hills covered with hickory and oak trees, split-rail fences that had been standing since before the Civil War, and farmhouses that looked like they'd been lifted straight out of a Norman Rockwell painting. The road itself was a winding two-lane that followed an old logging trail up into the mountains. During spring and summer, the canopy of trees created a green tunnel that filtered the sunlight into patterns of light and shadow. But today, with the temperature already climbing toward the 90 degrees and the humidity thick enough to cut with a knife, the beauty of the landscape was overshadowed by an oppressive sense of heat and stillness. The Ashford property sat at the end of a long gravel driveway that wound up through the trees to a substantial two-story house that had been built sometime in the 1920s. Miss Prudence's grandfather, Jeremiah Ashford, had made his fortune in the timber business and built the house as a symbol of his success. It was what folks in these parts called a city house, the kind of place a wealthy family might build if they wanted to live in the mountains, but maintain the conveniences and elegance of urban life. The house was impressive by any standard, with wide porches wrapping around both levels, tall windows with decorative shutters, and architectural details that spoke of considerable expense and craftsmanship. The grounds were immaculately maintained, with flower gardens, mature shade trees, and stone walkways that created an atmosphere of refined elegance that was unusual in our rural county. Miss Prudence met me on the front porch, and I could see immediately that she was genuinely shaken. She was a small woman, probably didn't weigh more than 90 pounds soaking wet, but she had always carried herself with the dignity and composure that came from good breeding and strong character. Today, though, she looked fragile and uncertain in a way that I'd never seen before. "Sheriff, I'm so grateful you came quickly," she said, leading me into the house. "I've been living in this house for 87 years, and I know every sound it makes, every creak in the floorboards, every way the light falls through the windows at different times of day. Someone has been in here, moving things, looking through my belongings, and I think they might still be hiding somewhere inside." The Ashford house was like stepping back in time. Miss Prudence had maintained it exactly as it had been during her childhood, with heavy wooden furniture, ornate wallpaper, and rooms full of antiques that probably belonged in a museum. The main floor consisted of a formal living room, a dining room with a table that could seat 12 people, a kitchen that had been modernized sometime in the 1950s and left unchanged since then, and a library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. Everything was impeccably clean and organized, reflecting the care and attention that Miss Prudence had devoted to maintaining her family's home for nearly 9 decades. But as I looked around, I could see subtle signs that someone had indeed been inside, disturbing the careful order that she had maintained. "What makes you think someone has been inside, Miss Prudence?" She led me into the library and pointed to a glass display case that contained what appeared to be a collection of antique jewelry, pocket watches, and small decorative objects. "This display case was locked when I went to bed last night, Sheriff. I always keep it locked because some of these pieces are quite valuable. But this morning it was standing open, and several items have been moved around. Nothing appears to be missing, but someone has definitely been handling my collection. I examined the display case carefully. It was an ornate piece of furniture with multiple shelves and compartments, the kind of thing that serious collectors use to showcase their most prized possessions. The lock showed no signs of being forced, and there was no evidence of damage to the case itself. Do you still have the key to this case, Miss Prudence? Of course. I keep it right here in this drawer. She opened a small drawer in a nearby desk and showed me an elaborate brass key. I'm the only person who has access to this key, and I distinctly remember locking the case yesterday evening after I cleaned the shelves. I asked Miss Prudence to show me around the rest of the house while I looked for signs of forced entry or other evidence that someone had been inside. We spent the better part of an hour going through every room, checking windows and doors, looking for anything that seemed out of place. What I found was puzzling. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere in the house. All the windows were securely latched from the inside, the doors were properly locked, and there was no evidence that anyone had tampered with the security system that Miss Prudence had installed a few years earlier. But there were subtle signs that someone had indeed been in the house. In the master bedroom, Miss Prudence showed me a jewelry box where several pieces had been moved from their usual positions. In the dining room, she pointed out that a silver tea service had been rearranged on the sideboard. In the kitchen, canned goods in the pantry had been shifted around, as if someone had been looking for something specific hidden behind them. Miss Prudence, is there anyone else who has a key to your house? Any family members, neighbors, service people? No, Sheriff. I'm the last of the Ashford family, and I've never been married. I do my own housekeeping and gardening, and I haven't had any repair work done in several years. I'm very careful about my security because I live alone and I have some valuable things in the house. I completed my search of the property, including the basement and the attic, but found no evidence that anyone was currently hiding in the house. I also checked the exterior of the building, looking for signs that someone might have climbed up to the second-story windows or found some other unconventional way to enter. I don't see any evidence of how someone might have gotten inside, Miss Prudence, but I believe you when you say that your things have been disturbed. I'm going to dust some surfaces for fingerprints, and I want you to make a detailed inventory of your valuables to make sure nothing is actually missing. We spent another hour going through the house while Miss Prudence checked her collections, and I documented everything with photographs. What we discovered was strange. Dozens of valuable items had been handled or moved, but nothing appeared to be missing. It was as if someone had broken into the house not to steal anything, but simply to examine Miss Prudence's possessions. Sheriff, this is very peculiar, Miss Prudence said as we concluded our inventory. If someone went to the trouble of getting into my house, why wouldn't they take anything? Some of these pieces are worth thousands of dollars, and they would be easy to carry away. That was exactly what I was wondering. Professional burglars don't usually break into houses just to rearrange the furniture and examine collectibles. There had to be some other motive for the intrusion. Miss Prudence, I'd like you to think carefully about whether you've noticed anyone showing unusual interest in your property or your collections recently. Anyone asking questions about your antiques. Anyone who seemed to be paying too much attention to your house. She considered this for several minutes before responding. Well, Sheriff, there was a man who came by about 3 weeks ago claiming to be researching local history. He said he was writing a book about prominent families in eastern Kentucky, and he wanted to interview me about my grandfather's timber business. Did you let him into the house? I did, Sheriff. He seemed very knowledgeable about local history, and he had credentials from some university. I gave him a tour of the house and showed him some of my grandfather's papers and photographs. He was particularly interested in my grandfather's collection. Miss Prudence led me back to the library and pointed to several additional display cases that I hadn't noticed during my initial examination. These contained what appeared to be much older and more unusual items: Native American artifacts, Civil War memorabilia, geological specimens, and various objects that looked like they belonged in a natural history museum. My grandfather was quite a collector, Sheriff. He acquired these items during his business travels throughout eastern Kentucky in the early 1900s. Some of them are quite rare, and a few might be historically significant. I studied the collections more carefully. Among the items were arrowheads, pottery fragments, old military buttons, vintage photographs, and several objects that I couldn't readily identify. One display case contained what appeared to be human bones, a skull, some ribs, and various other remains that had been arranged as if for scientific study. Miss Prudence, are those actual human remains? Oh, yes, Sheriff. Grandfather acquired those from some archaeological excavations in the 1920s. I'm not entirely sure how he came by them, but he was always fascinated by the early inhabitants of these mountains. That changed everything. If someone was specifically interested in Miss Prudence's grandfather's collection, particularly items that might have archaeological or historical significance, we could be dealing with artifact theft rather than ordinary burglary. There was a thriving black market for Native American artifacts and other historical objects, especially pieces that had been acquired through questionable means decades earlier. Miss Prudence, I'm going to need you to be extra careful about security for the next few weeks. I think someone is specifically interested in your grandfather's collection, and they might come back. Do you have somewhere you could stay while I investigate this further? I'm not leaving my house, Sheriff. I've lived here my entire life, and I'm not about to be driven away by some burglar, but I will be more careful, and I'll call you immediately if I notice anything unusual. I left the Ashford property with more questions than answers, but I had a strong suspicion that we were dealing with something more complex than a simple break-in. The fact that nothing had been stolen, combined with the intruder's apparent interest in examining specific collections, suggested that someone was conducting a reconnaissance mission in preparation for a more elaborate theft. Over the next few days, I researched the academic credentials of the man who had visited Miss Prudence. The university he claimed to represent had no record of anyone by his name, and the research project he described didn't exist in their historical department. The business card he had left with Miss Prudence led to a disconnected phone number and a post office box that had been rented with false identification. I also contacted the Kentucky State Police to ask about similar cases involving thefts of historical artifacts or suspicious individuals posing as academic researchers. What they told me was disturbing. Sheriff Crenshaw, we've had reports of similar incidents throughout eastern Kentucky over the past year, Detective Angus McBride told me during our phone conversation. Someone has been systematically visiting elderly residents who own significant collections of historical artifacts. In most cases, they pose as researchers or historians, gain access to private collections, and then return later to steal specific high-value items. Have they made any arrests? Not yet. Whoever is doing this is very professional and very patient. They study their targets for weeks or months before making any moves, and they're extremely careful about not leaving evidence. We think they're working with collectors or dealers who have specific items they want to acquire. Detective McBride warned me that the theft ring was likely to return to Miss Prudence's property, possibly using more aggressive methods if they couldn't gain access through deception. He recommended that I establish surveillance on the Ashford house and coordinate with state police if any suspicious activity was observed. I arranged for increased patrols on Blackberry Hill Road, and asked my deputies to keep a close eye on the Ashford property. I also advised Miss Prudence to install additional security measures and to contact us immediately if she noticed anything unusual. 3 weeks after the initial break-in, Miss Prudence called again, this time sounding genuinely frightened. "Sheriff Crenshaw, they're back. There are people on my property right now, and they're not trying to hide their presence. I can see lights moving around in my barn, and I heard vehicles driving up to the house about an hour ago." I was in my patrol car within 5 minutes, radioing for backup as I headed toward Blackberry Hill Road. The drive to Miss Prudence's house normally took about 20 minutes, but I made it in 12, arriving to find 2 vehicles parked in her driveway and clear signs of activity around the property. The vehicles were a black SUV with tinted windows and a white panel van with no identifying markings. Both had out-of-state license plates, and both looked like the kind of vehicles that professional criminals might use for moving stolen goods. Lights were visible in the barn and several outbuildings, and I could hear the sound of machinery running. I called for additional backup and established a perimeter around the property while waiting for other units to arrive. Within minutes, I could see people moving around the barn with flashlights and what appeared to be metal detectors or other electronic equipment. When my backup arrived, we approached the barn with weapons drawn and called for anyone inside to come out with their hands visible. What we found inside was a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple theft. The barn had been converted into a temporary laboratory and staging area. Tables held various pieces of electronic equipment, computers, and what appeared to be scientific instruments for analyzing artifacts. Several of Miss Prudence's grandfather's pieces were laid out on examination tables, along with documentation and photographs that suggested detailed study and cataloging. But the most disturbing discovery was a collection of items that clearly didn't belong to Miss Prudence. Artifacts from multiple sources were organized throughout the barn, each tagged and cataloged with information about their origin and estimated value. We had stumbled onto the central operation of a major artifact theft ring. 5 men were arrested at the scene, all carrying false identification and driving vehicles that had been purchased with fraudulent documents. Their leader identified himself as Dr. Marcus Kellerman, claiming to be an archaeological consultant working for a private collector who was interested in preserving historical artifacts. "Sheriff, we're not thieves," Kellerman insisted during questioning. "We're preservationists. These artifacts belong in proper collections where they can be studied and protected, not sitting in some old woman's house where they're not appreciated or understood." The investigation that followed revealed the scope of what we had uncovered. The theft ring had been operating for over 3 years, targeting elderly collectors throughout Appalachia who possessed artifacts that had been acquired during the early 1900s, when archaeological regulations were much less strict. Their method was sophisticated and patient. They would research potential targets through estate sales, auction records, and local historical societies. Once they identified someone with a valuable collection, they would send in a reconnaissance team posing as academics or researchers to gain access and catalog the items. If the target was cooperative and could be convinced to sell items voluntarily, they would make offers that seemed generous but were actually far below market value. If the target refused to sell or became suspicious, they would plan more aggressive methods of acquisition. In Miss Prudence's case, they had determined that her grandfather's collection included several items that were extremely valuable to private collectors. Native American artifacts from pre-Columbian periods, Civil War memorabilia that had been looted from battlefields, and geological specimens that contained rare minerals worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But the most shocking discovery came when we examined the human remains that had been part of Jeremiah Ashford's collection. Dr. Kellerman had brought in a forensic anthropologist who determined that the bones were not just historical artifacts. They were the remains of individuals who had been murdered, and the evidence suggested that Jeremiah Ashford himself might have been involved in their deaths. Sheriff, these bones show clear evidence of violent trauma, the forensic expert explained. Bullet wounds, knife marks, signs of struggle. These aren't archaeological specimens, they're evidence of homicides that occurred sometime in the 1920s or 1930s. The investigation expanded to include FBI specialists who examined Jeremiah Ashford's business records and personal papers. What they found painted a disturbing picture of a man who had used his legitimate timber business as a cover for much darker activities. During the 1920s and 1930s, Jeremiah Ashford had been involved in illegal activities throughout the eastern Kentucky mountains. He had been smuggling alcohol during Prohibition, running illegal gambling operations, and apparently eliminating people who threatened his business interests. The archaeological specimens in his collection were actually the remains of his victims, people who had crossed him or knew too much about his criminal activities. He had kept their bones as trophies, displaying them in his library as if they were legitimate scientific specimens. Miss Prudence was devastated by these revelations about her grandfather. She had spent her entire life maintaining his house and preserving his collections, never knowing that she was caring for evidence of multiple murders. "I had no idea, Sheriff," she told me through tears. "Grandfather always told me these were artifacts he had purchased from archaeological expeditions. I never questioned where they came from." The FBI investigation eventually identified the remains of 7 individuals who had been murdered by Jeremiah Ashford between 1923 and 1934. Most were local people who had been involved in his illegal businesses and had either tried to leave his organization or threatened to expose his activities. The artifact theft ring had discovered the true nature of the bone collection during their research and had planned to steal the remains not for their archaeological value, but because they contained evidence that could be used to blackmail wealthy families who might have been involved in Jeremiah Ashford's criminal activities. Dr. Kellerman eventually admitted that his organization was not just stealing artifacts for private collectors. They were involved in a sophisticated blackmail scheme that targeted prominent families throughout Appalachia who had ancestors involved in illegal activities during the early 1900s. Many of the old timber barons and coal mine owners were involved in activities that would destroy their families' reputations if they became public knowledge, Kellerman explained. "We identified evidence of these activities and used it to extort money from their descendants." The scope of the blackmail operation was staggering. Over 3 years, the organization had extorted millions of dollars from dozens of families throughout Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. They had identified evidence of murders, illegal land acquisitions, and other crimes committed by prominent ancestors and used this information to demand payments from living family members who wanted to protect their family names. Miss Prudence's case was particularly valuable to them because Jeremiah Ashford's activities had involved several other prominent families in the region. The evidence in his collection could have been used to blackmail multiple families simultaneously, creating a lucrative source of ongoing revenue. The criminal organization behind the scheme was far more sophisticated than a simple theft ring. They employed historians, genealogists, forensic specialists, and technology experts who could research family histories, identify criminal activities, and document evidence that could be used for blackmail. They had targeted families throughout Appalachia because the region's history of violence and illegal activities during the early 1900s provided numerous opportunities for extortion. Many prominent families had ancestors who had been involved in feuds, illegal businesses, or violent crimes that their descendants would pay substantial amounts to keep secret. The investigation revealed that the organization had been operating for over a decade, evolving from simple artifact theft to sophisticated historical research and blackmail. They had academic credentials and professional equipment that allowed them to conduct legitimate-seeming research while actually gathering information for criminal purposes. Miss Prudence became a key witness in the federal case against the organization. Despite her advanced age and the shock of learning about her grandfather's crimes, she was determined to help prosecutors bring the criminals to justice. "These people violated my home and my trust," she said during one of our interviews, "and they were planning to use my grandfather's terrible secrets to hurt other innocent families. I won't let that happen." The trial lasted 6 months and resulted in convictions for all members of the organization. Dr. Kellerman received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison for racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy charges. His associates received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. But the case had profound effects that extended far beyond the criminal convictions. The revelation that Jeremiah Ashford had been a murderer cast a shadow over Miss Prudence's entire family legacy. The house that had been her pride and joy became a constant reminder of her grandfather's crimes. More disturbing was the discovery that the organization had identified evidence of similar criminal activities by ancestors of dozens of other families throughout the region. Even though the blackmail scheme had been stopped, the historical evidence they had gathered continued to exist, creating ongoing concerns about how this information might be used in the future. The FBI classified much of the evidence gathered during the investigation to protect the privacy of families who might be affected by revelations about their ancestors' activities. But they warned that similar organizations might attempt to exploit historical crimes for profit. The Ashford case was just the tip of the iceberg, Agent Patricia Donovan told me after the trial. There are probably dozens of other organizations out there researching family histories and looking for evidence they can use for extortion. The internet has made this kind of research much easier and more profitable. Miss Prudence made the difficult decision to donate her grandfather's entire collection to the Kentucky State Museum, where the artifacts could be properly studied and the human remains could be given appropriate burial. She also established a fund to support research into the victims of historical crimes throughout Appalachia. "I can't undo what my grandfather did," she said during the donation ceremony, "but I can make sure his victims are remembered and that their families know the truth about what happened to them." The Ashford house was eventually sold to the Kentucky Historical Society, which converted it into a museum dedicated to the complex and often dark history of the Appalachian region. The museum includes exhibits about the legitimate businesses and cultural achievements of early mountain families, but it also addresses the violence and illegal activities that were part of the region's past. Miss Prudence moved to a smaller house in town, where she lived quietly until her death in 2024 at the age of 90. She never fully recovered from the shock of learning about her grandfather's crimes, but she found some peace in knowing that his victims had finally received justice, and that her family's dark secrets could no longer be used to hurt innocent people. The case changed my understanding of law enforcement in rural communities. I had always focused on current crimes and immediate threats, but the Ashford case showed me that the past can reach into the present in dangerous and unexpected ways. Historical crimes can create vulnerabilities that criminals can exploit decades or even centuries later. Family secrets that seem safely buried in the past can become weapons in the hands of people who know how to research and document evidence of wrongdoing. The case also revealed how criminals have adapted to use academic research and historical investigation as covers for illegal activities. The sophisticated methods used by Kellerman's organization made them difficult to detect and gave them access to information and victims that traditional criminals could never reach. As a result of the Ashford case, I established new protocols for investigating suspicious researchers and academics who show interest in local historical collections. I also developed relationships with university departments and historical societies, to help identify legitimate researchers and distinguish them from criminals who might be posing as academics. The Kentucky State Police created a task force specifically focused on historical extortion cases, recognizing that the Ashford case was likely just one example of a much larger problem affecting families throughout the region. But perhaps the most important lesson from the case was the realization that some families in our communities are carrying burdens they never chose and don't deserve. The descendants of people who committed crimes generations ago shouldn't be held responsible for their ancestors' actions, but they can still be victimized by criminals who discover evidence of historical wrongdoing. Law enforcement has a responsibility to protect these families from exploitation, while also ensuring that historical crimes are properly investigated and documented. It's a delicate balance between respecting the privacy of living people and honoring the memory of victims who died long before anyone alive today was born. The Ashford case taught me that the past never really dies. It just gets buried deeper, waiting for someone to dig it up and use it for their own purposes. Sometimes those purposes are legitimate historical research and education, but sometimes they're criminal schemes that can destroy families and communities. As sheriff of Ravens Hollow County, I've learned to pay attention to people who show too much interest in local history, especially when they're asking questions about specific families or collections. Not all researchers are criminals, but all criminals researching historical crimes are dangerous. The mountains of eastern Kentucky hold many secrets, some buried so deep that most people have forgotten they exist. But there are always people looking to dig up those secrets, and not all of them have good intentions. Miss Prudence Ashford spent 87 years caring for a house full of evidence she never knew existed. Her story is a reminder that we're all custodians of history, whether we realize it or not, and that the choices made by previous generations can have consequences that extend far beyond their lifetimes. The Collector's Estate on Blackberry Hill Road is now a museum where visitors can learn about the complex history of our region. But for those of us who knew Miss Prudence and witnessed the destruction of her family's reputation, it will always be a reminder that some collections come with prices that no one should have to pay, and that the most dangerous thieves are often the ones who steal not objects, but the peace of mind that comes from believing your family's past is something to be proud of. The case remains one of the most complex and disturbing investigations of my career. It showed me that in law enforcement, you're not just protecting people from present dangers, you're also protecting them from the ghosts of crimes committed long before they were born. Crimes that can reach across decades to destroy lives and families in ways that the original perpetrators never imagined. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving past the old Ashford place, now the Appalachian History Museum, I think about Miss Prudence and how she spent most of her life unknowingly preserving evidence of her grandfather's murders. I wonder how many other people in our county are living with family secrets they don't know about. Secrets that could be discovered and used against them by criminals who specialize in digging up the past. The truth is that we're all vulnerable to the crimes of our ancestors, whether we know it or not. The past has a way of surviving, hidden in collections and archives and family stories that get passed down through generations. And there are always people looking to profit from those hidden truths, people who understand that sometimes the most valuable thing you can steal from someone is their belief in their own family's honor. That's the real lesson of the Collector's Estate, that we're all collectors of our family's history, whether we choose to be or not, and that sometimes the most precious things we're protecting are the ones we don't even know we have.